The Duke was kissing the wrong woman. Elena Whitlock stood frozen in the doorway of the estate's grand hall, her breath catching as she watched Adrian Vale, the man her father had promised her to in writing 3 years ago, take her sister Lydia's gloved hand and press it to his lips. Lydia's laugh rang out like crystal, bright and triumphant, while Elena's fingers gripped the doorframe until splinters bit into her palm. 36 hours. That's all it had taken for her entire future to be stolen, repackaged, and presented in a prettier box. And she had let it happen. Again. Always again. But this time, watching Lydia's performance and Adrian's blind acceptance, something ancient and furious began to crack open inside Elena's chest. A thing she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it had teeth. Stay with me until the end. Drop a like and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Elena remembered because Tuesdays meant the quarterly accounts were due, and she'd been 3 hours into reconciling the estate's crumbling finances when her father's study door crashed open. Lord Christopher Whitlock stood there, waving a piece of cream-colored paper like it was a royal decree. "It's done," he'd announced, his jowls quivering with something between relief and triumph. "Duke Vale confirms his arrival. 2 weeks. The engagement stands." Elena had looked up from the ledger where she'd just discovered another £200 missing from the tenant relief fund, money her father had likely gambled away, and felt nothing. Not excitement, not fear, just the familiar weight of inevitability settling over her shoulders like a cloak she'd been wearing since she was 15. 2 weeks, she'd repeated, her voice flat. "You'll need new dresses, something to make you look less like a governess and more like a woman." Her father had squinted at her across the mahogany desk, taking in her severe bun, her ink-stained fingers, her complete lack of enthusiasm. "Christ, Elena, try to look pleased. The man's a duke. You'll be set for life." Set for life. As if her life wasn't already set in stone, set in silence, set in the margins of everyone else's story. She'd nodded, made appropriate noises, and returned to the accounts after he left. The missing £200 wouldn't reconcile themselves, and the tenant families in the East cottages needed roofs before winter. Those were real problems. The rest, the dresses, the Duke, the future she'd been promised before she was old enough to understand what promises meant, felt abstract, distant, like something happening to someone else. That had been her first mistake. Her second was telling Lydia. "Mom." "A Duke!" Lydia had shrieked, bursting into Elena's bedroom that same evening without knocking, as she never did. "Father says you're marrying a Duke and you didn't tell me?" Elena had been drafting letters to 3 different suppliers, trying to negotiate better terms for the estate's wool purchases. She set down her pen and looked at her sister. Really looked at her. Lydia at 22 was everything Elena at 28 was not. Golden-haired where Elena was dark, effervescent where Elena was measured, adored where Elena was useful. "It's an old arrangement," Elena had said carefully, "from before Mother died. I'd honestly forgotten about it." That wasn't quite true. She'd thought about it occasionally over the years, the way you might think about a dental appointment scheduled far in the future, with vague dread and the hope that circumstances might intervene. Adrian Vale had been 18 when the betrothal was arranged. She 16. She'd met him once, briefly, at some London function she'd attended with her parents. He'd been tall, she remembered, good posture. He'd said something polite about the weather. That was the sum total of her knowledge about the man she was apparently going to marry. Forgotten? Lydia collapsed onto Elena's bed in a swirl of pink silk and expensive perfume. "How do you forget about a Duke? What's he like? Is he handsome, young? Father said he's coming here to Thornfield. When? Can I meet him?" "I assume you'll meet him at the engagement dinner," Elena had said, turning back to her letters. "Along with everyone else. But what will you wear? What will you talk about? Oh, Elena, you can't just sit there like a lump and expect him to fall in love with you. Men need—" "Lydia." Elena's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "I have work to finish. We can discuss my shortcomings as a potential duchess later." Lydia had gone quiet. Not chastened. Lydia was never chastened, but calculating. Elena had recognized that silence. It was the same silence that preceded Lydia borrowing Elena's pearl earrings and losing them at a garden party. The same silence before Lydia convinced their father that she, not Elena, should make the trip to London last season because Elena wouldn't even enjoy it. But Elena had been tired. The accounts had been a disaster. 3 tenant families were behind on rent. The Westfield drainage system had failed again, and she'd just discovered that the housekeeper was skimming off the top of the household budget. She'd had neither the energy nor the inclination to decode whatever scheme was brewing behind Lydia's china blue eyes. Third mistake. The 2 weeks had passed in a blur of preparations that somehow never involved Elena. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, had thrown herself into a frenzy of cleaning, as if the Duke might inspect the undersides of furniture. The cook had ordered provisions for elaborate meals. Lydia had acquired 4 new dresses, each more elaborate than the last, and had taken to practicing her curtsy in the main hall. Elena had continued managing the estate. She'd negotiated a contract extension with the wool merchant, arranged for repairs to the tenant cottages, and resolved a boundary dispute between 2 farmers that had been festering for months. She'd done it all quietly, efficiently, the way she did everything, moving through Thornfield like a ghost who happened to keep the entire machine running. No one had thanked her. No one ever did. The day before Duke Vale's arrival, Lydia had appeared in the estate office where Elena was reviewing the quarterly reports. "You should wear the green silk tomorrow," Lydia had announced, perching on the edge of Elena's desk and crushing a stack of correspondence. "The one with the high neck. It makes you look less severe." "I'll take that under advisement," Elena had said, moving the letters out from under Lydia's hip. "I'm serious, Elena. First impressions matter. You need to—" Lydia had paused, studying her with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. "You need to make him see you." The irony had been so thick Elena could have choked on it. Make him see you. As if being seen had ever been Elena's problem. She'd been seen as the competent daughter, the reliable one, the one who fixed things. What she'd never been was wanted. "I'll do my best," she'd said, which was what she always said when she meant, "I'll do what's necessary and no more." Lydia had left, trailing perfume and some unspoken thought. Elena had returned to her reports. 4th mistake. 5th. She'd lost count. Duke Adrian Vale had arrived at Thornfield at precisely 3 o'clock on a gray October afternoon, with a carriage, 4 horses, 2 trunks, and a valet who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Elena had been in the East Field when he arrived, mediating yet another dispute, this time between the head groundskeeper and a tenant farmer about a fallen oak tree that had damaged a fence. By the time she'd resolved it, split the timber between them, estate pays for fence repair, trudged back through the mud, and entered through the kitchen entrance to avoid tracking dirt through the main hall, the Duke was already ensconced in the drawing room with her father. And Lydia. Elena had stood in the kitchen, her boots caked with mud, her hair escaping its pins, while the cook fussed over the dinner preparations and pretended not to stare at her. She should have changed immediately, should have rushed upstairs, made herself presentable, joined the gathering in the drawing room like the prospective bride she was supposed to be. Instead, she'd gone to her office and finished the correspondence she'd left incomplete. It was nearly dinner time when her father had sent a maid to fetch her, his message terse. "Where the hell are you?" She'd changed quickly, choosing not the green silk, but a simple gray dress that didn't require a maid's assistance. Her hair she'd pinned up efficiently. No elaborate curls, no ribbons, just a smooth knot at the base of her neck. In the mirror, she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had more important things to do than primp. The drawing room had been full of laughter when she'd entered. Adrian Vale had been standing by the fireplace, and her first thought was that he'd grown into his posture. He was tall, she'd remembered that, but he'd developed the kind of casual authority that came from a lifetime of doors opening at his approach. Dark hair, gray eyes, a face that was more interesting than handsome, though women probably called it both. He'd been laughing at something Lydia had said. Lydia, who was radiant in ice blue silk, her golden hair arranged in perfect ringlets, her laugh pitched at precisely the right frequency to sound genuine while actually being performance. Lydia, who had somehow positioned herself in the exact spot where the firelight would catch her profile. "Ah, Elena," her father had said, his tone heavy with barely concealed annoyance. "Finally, Duke Vale, may I present my eldest daughter, Miss Elena Whitlock." Adrian had turned, and Elena had curtsied, a brief, efficient dip that met the minimum requirements of courtesy. "Miss Whitlock," he'd said, and his voice had been pleasant, educated, utterly neutral. "A pleasure." Your Grace. She'd met his eyes for exactly the appropriate length of time. Not too long, not too brief. Gray, she'd noted distantly, with flecks of something darker near the iris. I was just telling His Grace about the new gardens, Lydia had interjected, gliding forward to reclaim the Duke's attention. The roses are particularly beautiful this year. Elena helped plan them. A lie. Elena had planned them, period. Had chosen every variety, had worked with the gardeners to design the layout, had personally ensured proper drainage because the previous design had been a waterlogged disaster. Lydia had contributed exactly one thing, showing them to her friends at a garden party and accepting compliments. But Elena had said nothing. She'd simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without correcting it. "They're lovely," Adrian had said, his attention already back on Lydia. "I noticed them when I arrived. You clearly have an eye for beauty." Lydia had practically glowed. Their father had beamed, and Elena had felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest, the knowledge that this was how it would be. Lydia would sparkle and charm and claim credit. Elena would fade into the wallpaper. The Duke would fall for the illusion because everyone always did. And she would marry him anyway because what choice did she have? Dinner had been an exercise in endurance. They'd eaten in the formal dining room, at a space Elena usually avoided because it required too many servants to maintain and wasted fuel heating a room they used maybe 4 times a year. But her father had insisted, and so they'd gathered around the long mahogany table. Lord Whitlock at the head, Adrian to his right, Lydia strategically placed beside Adrian, and Elena relegated to the far end, practically in another county. The conversation had flowed around her like water around a stone. Lydia had been in rare form, regaling Adrian with carefully edited stories of their life at Thornfield. The time they'd held a summer ball. Elena had organized it. Lydia had worn a memorable dress. The charity work they did in the village. Elena managed the estate's charitable fund. Lydia occasionally distributed baskets at Christmas, with photographers present. The literary salon they hosted, Elena ran it. Lydia performed poetry readings. Adrian had listened with every appearance of genuine interest, asking questions, laughing at appropriate moments, playing his role of charmed suitor with practiced ease. Elena had eaten her soup and wondered if anyone would notice if she simply got up and left. "Miss Whitlock," Adrian had said suddenly, his voice cutting through Lydia's monologue about the complexities of choosing bonnet ribbons. "Your father mentioned you manage much of the estate's business. That's unusual, isn't it?" The table had gone quiet. Lydia's smile had frozen. Their father had looked uncomfortable. Elena had set down her spoon and met Adrian's gaze across the expanse of mahogany and candelabras. Unusual, perhaps? Necessary, certainly. "Elena has always been the practical one," Lord Whitlock had interjected quickly. "Takes after her mother, head for numbers, that sort of thing. Very useful, of course, but hardly the sort of thing for dinner conversation," Lydia had finished, her voice light but her eyes sharp. "Surely you don't want to bore His Grace with discussions of crop rotation and tenant disputes." "On the contrary," Adrian had said, still looking at Elena, "I find estate management fascinating. My own steward retired last year, and I've been handling most of it myself. Perhaps you could share your thoughts on the new agricultural techniques being discussed in Parliament." It had been a test. Elena had recognized it immediately, the sort of polite probe men like Adrian used to determine whether women like her actually knew anything or simply parroted what they'd overheard from men. She'd considered her response carefully. She could demur, play ignorant, let Lydia redirect to safer topics. Or she could answer honestly and risk appearing too knowledgeable, too unfeminine, too much. "The 4-field rotation system has merit," she'd said finally, "but it requires significant capital investment that most tenant farmers can't afford without estate support. And the enclosure movement, while economically efficient, displaces families who've worked the same land for generations. I've found that gradual modernization with proper tenant protections produces better yields and less social unrest." Silence. Lydia had looked horrified. Their father had looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Adrian had smiled. A real smile, not the polite mask he'd worn all evening. "You've read Townsend's work." "And found it incomplete," Elena had replied. "He doesn't account for regional soil variations or the human cost of rapid agricultural transition." Fascinating. Adrian had leaned forward slightly. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on Perhaps we should move to the drawing room, Lydia had announced, standing so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. I promised to play for His Grace. Elena, you don't mind, do you? It hadn't been a question. The drawing room performance had been textbook Lydia. She'd positioned herself at the pianoforte with the lamplight arranged to create a soft halo effect. She'd chosen pieces that showcased her technical skill without being too challenging. She'd looked up at Adrian through her lashes at precisely calculated intervals. And he'd watched, because what else could he do? Elena had stood by this window, half hidden by the heavy velvet curtains, and observed. Not the performance. She'd seen Lydia play dozens of times. No, she'd watched Adrian. Watched the way he paid attention with his whole body, the polite tilt of his head, the appropriate murmurs of appreciation. He was good at this, she'd realized. Good at making people feel seen and valued, even when he was going through the motions. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made her tired. Your sister is remarkably talented, he'd said quietly, appearing beside her so suddenly she'd startled. Elena had recovered quickly, folding her hands at her waist. She's practiced. You don't play. I do. She'd paused, considering how much truth to offer. But not for audiences. Why not? Because when I play, I forget to smile and make eye contact. Because I close my eyes and lose myself in the music, and apparently that's unsettling to watch. Because the one time I performed publicly, I overheard someone say I looked like I was communing with ghosts. I prefer it as a private pleasure, she'd said instead. Adrian had been quiet for a moment, watching Lydia's performance. Then, your father said this engagement was arranged years ago. I apologize that I don't remember our meeting well. I was young and probably insufferable. You were polite, Elena had said. We spoke for perhaps 5 minutes. About the weather? Predominantly. A laugh had escaped him. Brief, genuine. Well, we've improved on that at least. Agricultural policy is marginally more interesting than rain. Elena had felt something dangerous flutter in her chest. Something that might have been hope or humor, or the treacherous beginning of actually liking him. She'd crushed it immediately. Marginally, she'd agreed, her voice carefully flat. Lydia's song had ended to enthusiastic applause. She'd stood, curtsied gracefully, and turned to find Adrian no longer watching her. Instead, he'd been at the window with Elena, both of them slightly apart from the room, and for just a moment Lydia's mask had slipped. Elena had seen it, the flash of calculation, of assessment, of something cold and determined. And still, she'd done nothing. Bossat. The next morning, Elena had woken at dawn as she always did. She'd dressed, breakfasted alone in the small parlor while reviewing the day's tasks, and was halfway through a meeting with the estate steward when Lydia had appeared in the doorway of the office. We need to talk, Lydia had announced. Elena had dismissed the steward and waited until the door closed. About? About the fact that you're trying to sabotage this. Lydia had crossed her arms, her pretty face set in hard lines. Last night. Monopolizing his attention, showing off with all that boring political talk. I answered a question he asked me directly. You made me look like an idiot. You made yourself look decorative, Elena had corrected, which is what you wanted. I made myself look competent, which apparently threatens you. These things can coexist. Don't. Lydia's voice had dropped to something dangerous. Don't pretend you're better than me because you can quote some dusty book about farming. You think that's what he wants? A woman who knows about crop rotation? He wants someone who can run a household, host parties, look beautiful on his arm, not someone who dresses like a governess and spends all day covered in account books and mud. Elena had stood slowly, drawing herself to her full height, 3 inches taller than Lydia, though Lydia usually managed to make that irrelevant. What exactly are you saying, Lydia? I'm saying you're going to lose him. Lydia had stepped closer, and for the first time, Elena had seen something like desperation beneath the anger. You don't know how to make a man want you. You don't even try. And when he realizes what a mistake this is, when he calls off the engagement, father will be humiliated. The estate will suffer, and it will be your fault. Ah. Elena had understood then. This isn't about protecting me. It's about protecting your social position. If I fail to secure the Duke, it reflects poorly on the entire family. So don't fail, Lydia had snapped. For once in your life, try, smile, flirt. Wear something that doesn't look like you're in mourning. Let him see the sister everyone actually likes instead of the one who hides in the office and judges everyone. It had been a masterpiece of manipulation, equal parts criticism and appeal to duty. And it might have worked if Elena hadn't spent 28 years learning to decode Lydia's tactics. "I'll take your concerns under advisement," Elena had said, which was her way of saying, "I'll do nothing differently, and we both know it." Lydia had left in a swirl of skirts and frustration. Elena had returned to her accounts and tried to ignore the small, treacherous voice whispering that maybe Lydia was right. Maybe she was sabotaging this. Maybe the part of her that had watched Adrian laugh with Lydia and felt relieved instead of jealous was trying to escape a future she'd never wanted. Maybe being invisible was easier than being seen for what she actually was, a woman who didn't fit the mold and had no interest in reshaping herself. Adrian had stayed at Thornfield for 3 days. 3 days during which Lydia had orchestrated a campaign of charm so relentless it should have been exhausting to witness. Walks in the garden where she'd clutched his arm and exclaimed over every flower. Tea in the conservatory where she'd poured with exquisite grace and laughed at his comments with perfectly modulated delight. Evening performances of increasingly complex musical pieces that showcased her natural talent, earned through years of expensive tutors and practice so rigorous it had once made her cry. And through it all, Elena had continued running the estate. She'd met with tenants, reviewed contracts, resolved disputes, balanced books. She'd been vaguely aware of Adrian's presence the way you're aware of a storm system moving through, something significant happening in the atmosphere that didn't directly concern you until it did. He'd sought her out twice more. Once in the library, where he'd found her researching land drainage systems, and they'd had a 30-minute conversation about soil permeability that had been the most intellectually stimulating exchange she'd had in months. Once in the estate office, where he'd asked to see the account books and she'd shown him, watching his eyebrows climb as he'd taken in the meticulous organization and the notes she'd made about cost-saving measures. "You run this place," he'd said, and it hadn't been a question. "Someone has to," she'd replied. "Your father has other priorities." Adrian had looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "And after we're married, will you continue this?" It was the first time either of them had mentioned the marriage as a certainty rather than an abstraction. "I assumed you'd have your own steward," Elena had said carefully. "Your own systems." "I'm asking what you want," what she wanted, as if that had ever been relevant. "I want the people who depend on this estate to be taken care of," she'd said finally. "Everything else is negotiable." He'd nodded slowly, and she'd hoped, maybe, that he understood, that he saw what she was. Not a decorative wife, but a partner who could share the burden of responsibility. Then Lydia had appeared in the doorway, bright and breathless. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Cook has prepared tea in the garden. You must come, both of you. The weather is perfect." And just like that, the moment had dissolved. On the evening before his departure, there had been a formal dinner. Lord Whitlock had invited half the county, neighbors, minor gentry, anyone who could witness the triumph of the Whitlock family securing a ducal match. The dining room had been packed, the conversation loud, the wine flowing freely. Elena had been seated, once again, at the far end of the table. Lydia had claimed the position of hostess beside Adrian, playing the role of future duchess with such conviction that several guests had actually congratulated her on the engagement. She hadn't corrected them. Elena had watched it happen in real time, the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the room's understanding. Lydia's hand on Adrian's arm, Lydia laughing at his comments, Lydia accepting compliments about her upcoming nuptials with demure smiles and lowered eyes. And Adrian, to his credit, had looked confused. He'd glanced down the table at Elena several times, his brow furrowed, as if trying to reconcile what was happening with what he'd been told. But he hadn't corrected anyone either. After dinner, when the women had withdrawn and the men had stayed for port and cigars, one of the neighbor ladies, Mrs. Pemberton, a woman whose primary occupation was gossip, had cornered Elena near the punch bowl. "Such a match for your sister," she'd cooed. "A duke! Your father must be beside himself with joy." Elena had gone very still. "I'm sorry? Oh, I know it's not official yet, but really, everyone can see the way he looks at her, and she's such a lovely girl. So accomplished. I said to Mr. Pemberton just this evening, that Lydia Whitlock will make the most beautiful duchess. The punch glass in Elena's hand had trembled. Just slightly, just enough that the liquid had rippled. There seems to be some confusion, Elena had said, and her voice had sounded distant even to her own ears. The arrangement is, oh, I know, these things take time. But between you and me, Mrs. Pemberton had leaned in conspiratorially. I think he'll propose before the week is out. Mark my words. She'd drifted away before Elena could respond, leaving Elena standing alone by the punch bowl, holding a glass she no longer wanted, in a room full of people celebrating an engagement that wasn't happening to the sister who wasn't her. And something inside Elena, something that had been bending and bending for years, finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet snap, like a thread pulled too tight. She'd set down the glass, walked out of the drawing room, through the main hall, and straight out the front door into the October night. The cold air had hit her like a slap. She'd kept walking, past the manicured gardens, past the fountain, down the gravel path that led to the eastern overlook where she sometimes came to think. The moon had been half full, casting everything in silver and shadow. She'd stood there, shivering in her dinner dress, and made herself ask the question she'd been avoiding. What am I doing? The answer came quickly, brutally, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for recognition that would never come, waiting for Lydia to stop taking and her father to start seeing, and Adrian to choose the right woman without being told which one she was, waiting for her life to start while watching it slip away. Miss Whitlock? She'd spun around to find Adrian standing a few feet behind her, his jacket collar turned up against the cold, looking concerned and confused and frustratingly real. I saw you leave, he'd said. Are you all right? No. Yes. You looked upset. I'm fine. The words had come out too sharp. You should return to the party. People will notice your absence. They'll notice yours first. He'd stepped closer. Elena, Miss Whitlock, what's wrong? And there it was. The opening. The moment where she could tell him everything. Where she could say, I'm the one you're supposed to marry, and my sister is systematically erasing me from my own engagement, and I've been too proud and too tired to fight her for something I'm not sure I even want. Instead, she'd said, nothing's wrong. I simply needed air. You're shaking. It's cold. It's more than that. He'd shrugged out of his jacket and stepped forward to drape it over her shoulders. The gesture had been automatic, courteous, and it had made everything worse because it was the kind of thing a good man would do, and she was beginning to suspect Adrian Vale might actually be a good man, which meant watching him fall for Lydia's performance was going to hurt more than she'd anticipated. The jacket had smelled like wool and sandalwood and leather. She'd pulled it tighter around her shoulders. The engagement, Adrian had said suddenly. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Her heart had stopped. Yes? Do you want this? Because if you don't, if this is all your father's ambition and you're just going along with it, I need to know. I won't trap someone in a marriage they don't want. I'm not that kind of man. It was the right question, the noble question, and it gave her the perfect escape. She could say no. She could release him from the obligation, let him pursue Lydia if that's what he wanted, free herself from a future that felt like a beautiful cage. She could go back to her quiet life, her account books, her invisible competence. She could disappear completely and maybe, finally, find peace in the erasure. The words had been right there. I don't want this. Let me go. But what came out instead was, I don't know what I want. Truth. Raw and undisciplined and completely unlike her. Adrian had studied her face in the moonlight, and she'd realized with a start that he was actually looking at her, not at an idea of her, not at a duty, but at her, Elena, standing there in borrowed warmth and uncertainty. That's honest, he'd said finally. I can work with honest. Then Lydia's voice had rung out across the garden. Adrian, where are you? And just like that, the spell had broken. Adrian had stepped back, creating proper distance. Elena had started to shrug off his jacket, but he'd shaken his head. Keep it. I'll retrieve it later. He'd returned to the party. Lydia's delighted laughter had echoed back across the garden moments later. Elena had stayed on the overlook until her shivers had turned violent and her feet had gone numb. When she'd finally returned to the house, the party had been winding down. She'd slipped upstairs unnoticed, hung Adrian's jacket carefully over her desk chair, and sat in the dark for a long time, trying to figure out what she'd just failed to do. Adrian had left the next morning, early, before breakfast, with promises to write and return soon to finalize arrangements. He'd said goodbye to Lord Whitlock in the study, to Lydia in the drawing room with her hand pressed to her heart like a romance novel heroine. To Elena, he'd said nothing. She'd watched his carriage disappear down the drive from her office window, his jacket still draped over her chair, and told herself the hollow feeling in her chest was relief. 3 days later, the first letter had arrived, addressed to the Whitlock family, written in Adrian's precise hand. Full of polite gratitude for the hospitality and pleasant observations about his journey home. And at the end, almost as an afterthought, please give my particular regards to Miss Lydia for her kindness and Miss Elena for her candor. Lydia had read the letter aloud at breakfast, her voice sweet as honey, her eyes triumphant when they'd met Elena's. His particular regards to me for kindness, she'd mused. How lovely. Elena had said nothing. She'd finished her tea, excused herself, and gone to deal with a problem at the mill. The second letter arrived a week later. Then a third, then a fourth, all addressed to the family, all containing carefully neutral language that could apply to anyone, all providing Lydia with material to construct whatever narrative she wanted, and construct it she did. Ciao. He writes so beautifully, Lydia had announced at dinner one evening, waving the latest letter like a trophy. Listen to this. The weather here continues mild, and I find myself thinking of warmer days in your delightful company. Your delightful company. He means me, obviously. He addressed it to the family. Elena had pointed out quietly. Oh, Elena, don't be dense. He can hardly write love letters when we're not formally engaged. This is how these things are done. He's being discreet. Lydia had smiled, and there had been something sharp beneath it. You wouldn't understand. You've never been courted. Their father had said nothing, just nodded along with whatever Lydia declared, because Lydia was his favorite and Elena was his bookkeeper. Elena had stopped reading the letters after that. Let Lydia have them. Let her spin whatever story she needed. Elena had work to do. The Eastfield needed drainage. The mill contract was up for renewal. 3 tenant families were struggling after a bad harvest, and she needed to negotiate payment extensions without destabilizing the estate's cash flow. Those were concrete problems with concrete solutions. Letters from a duke who couldn't be bothered to specify which sister he was writing to? Those were Lydia's domain now. Time had passed. Fall had turned to winter. The letters had continued, increasingly frequent, increasingly warm in tone if you squinted and tilted your head and convinced yourself they were meant for you specifically. Lydia had collected them like trophies, had started casually mentioning "when I'm Duchess" in conversations, had ordered new clothes for the engagement party, and Elena had let it happen. Let it happen through Christmas, when Lydia had held court at holiday gatherings and accepted congratulations for an engagement that hadn't occurred. Let it happen through January, when she'd started planning a hypothetical wedding. Let it happen through February, when Adrian's letters had started including small gifts, a book of poetry, a silk scarf, a brooch in the shape of a bird, all addressed to the Whitlock household, all claimed by Lydia. And then, on a cold March morning, the letter had arrived that changed everything. Elena had been in the stables discussing a sick horse with the head groom when a footman had found her. Miss Elena, your father requires you in his study immediately. She'd gone, still smelling of hay and horse, expecting another crisis to solve. Instead, she'd found her father behind his desk, Lydia in the chair opposite, and an open letter between them. He's coming back, Lord Whitlock had announced without preamble. Duke Vale, week after next, says it's time to make things official. Elena's stomach had dropped. Official. The engagement. Lydia had been vibrating with barely contained excitement. He's going to propose. Formally. He says he wants to do it properly, in person, with family present. Elena had looked at the letter on the desk, at the address, the Whitlock family, at the careful, neutral language that could mean anything. He doesn't specify, she'd started. Don't, Lydia had cut her off. Don't you dare. You know who he means. You've known for months. You've just been too stubborn to admit it. Lydia, Elena had said carefully. The original arrangement was made when you were children. People change. He's changed. He's chosen me. Accept it with grace for once in your life. Elena had looked at her father, waiting for him to intervene, to remind Lydia of the contract, to acknowledge that this was wrong. Lord Whitlock had cleared his throat uncomfortably. Elena, dear, perhaps Lydia is right. The Duke has spent months corresponding with her. He sent her gifts. If his affections have shifted, it might be better for everyone to acknowledge it now rather than force an engagement that would make you both miserable. You're giving me permission to step aside. Elena's voice had been flat. I'm suggesting that perhaps it's for the best. Lydia clearly has feelings for him. You've never shown any interest in marriage. Why not let her have this? Why not let her have this? As if Elena's entire future was a dress Lydia wanted to borrow. And the worst part, the part that made Elena want to laugh or scream or both, was that he wasn't entirely wrong. She hadn't shown interest in marriage. She'd treated the engagement like a business arrangement because that's all she knew how to do. But that didn't make it Lydia's. I need to think, Elena had said. Think quickly, Lydia had replied. He'll be here in 2 weeks. I need time to prepare. Elena had left the study, walked directly to her room, locked the door, and stood there in the middle of her utterly functional, utterly impersonal space, trying to remember the last time she'd fought for something she wanted, instead of just managing what she'd been given. She couldn't, because the truth was, she'd spent so long being useful that she'd forgotten how to be wanted. And now, faced with the choice between fighting for a man she barely knew or letting her sister have him, she couldn't figure out which outcome would make her more miserable. Outside her window, the first crocuses were blooming. Spring was coming, and in 2 weeks, so was Adrian Vale. The decision came to Elena in the middle of the night, 14 days before Adrian's return. She'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, Lydia was probably dreaming of Duchess coronets and London townhouses. Their father was likely snoring off too much port. And Elena was doing what she always did, calculating, measuring, trying to find the solution that would cause the least damage. Except this time, the numbers wouldn't balance. She sat up, lit the lamp on her bedside table, and pulled out a piece of paper. Drew a line down the middle. On one side, she wrote, "Let Lydia have him." On the other, "Fight." Under "Let Lydia have him," the list grew quickly. No confrontation. Father stays happy. Lydia gets what she wants. Life continues as normal. You remain useful, invisible, safe. Under "Fight," she wrote one word, "Truth." Then she stared at it for 20 minutes. Truth. What a luxury. What a weapon. What a terrifying, ridiculous thing to build a future on. She crumpled the paper, threw it in the fireplace, and watched it burn. When morning came, she was already dressed and waiting in her father's study when he arrived for breakfast. Elena. He'd stopped in the doorway, surprised. What are you doing here? I want to see the original betrothal agreement. His face had gone carefully blank. Why? Because Lydia seems to think it's negotiable. I'd like to review the actual terms. Elena, we've discussed this. If Adrian's affections have shifted, show me the contract, Father. Something in her voice must have convinced him that arguing would take more energy than compliance. He'd crossed to his desk, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a leather portfolio. Inside, yellowed with age but still legally binding, was the agreement her parents had signed with the Duke of Vale's family 16 years ago. Elena had read it carefully. All of it. The provisions, the dowry terms, the clause about the eldest daughter of Christopher Whitlock, namely Elena Charlotte Whitlock, namely Elena. Not a daughter, not whichever daughter is most suitable. Her, by name, in writing, witnessed and signed. This is a legal contract, Elena had said quietly. Contracts can be modified by mutual agreement. Has Adrian agreed to a modification? Her father had shifted uncomfortably. Not in so many words, but his intentions are clear. Are they? Elena had looked up from the document. Because, from where I'm standing, he's been writing letters to the Whitlock family and sending gifts to the household. He hasn't specifically courted Lydia. She's courted herself on his behalf. Elena, for heaven's sake, I'm going to tell him. The words had hung in the air between them. Tell him what? Lord Whitlock's voice had gone dangerously quiet. The truth. That the contract specifies me. That Lydia has been misrepresenting the situation. You'll humiliate your sister. Lydia is humiliating herself. I'm simply declining to participate further. Her father had stood, his face flushing red. I forbid it. Do you hear me? You will not sabotage this family with your prideful— It's not pride. Elena had stood as well, and she'd been surprised by how steady her voice was. It's honesty, something this family seems to have forgotten the value of. If you do this, if you embarrass Lydia in front of the Duke, I will cut you off. No inheritance, no home. You'll have nothing. Elena had looked at the man who was supposed to protect her, advocate for her, love her, and saw only a weak bully who'd chosen his favorite daughter years ago and never looked back. Then I'll have nothing, she'd said, but I'll have it honestly. She'd walked out before he could respond, the betrothal contract still in her hand. The next 2 weeks had been warfare conducted in silence. Lydia had stopped speaking to her entirely, communicating only through icy glares and the occasional servant-delivered message. Their father had taken to dining in his study, unable to face both daughters at once. And Elena had continued running the estate because someone had to, even as the household crumbled into factions around her. The servants had noticed. Of course they had. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, had cornered Elena in the hallway 3 days before Adrian's arrival. Miss Elena, if I may speak plainly— You always do, Mrs. Hartwell. The older woman had folded her arms, her expression troubled. The staff is concerned. There's talk of a dispute between you and Miss Lydia regarding the Duke. The staff is perceptive. We want you to know— Mrs. Hartwell had paused, choosing her words carefully. Most of us remember who keeps this house running, who negotiated better wages last year, who makes sure the tenant families don't go hungry. It's not Miss Lydia. Elena had felt something dangerous prickle behind her eyes. I appreciate that, but it's complicated. It's not complicated, miss. It's simple. Miss Lydia takes credit for your work, and now she's trying to take credit for your future. Some of us think that's wrong. And if speaking up costs me everything— Mrs. Hartwell had smiled grimly. Then you'll land on your feet, because you always do. But Miss Lydia? Without you propping her up? She'd shaken her head. The house of cards falls down. After she'd left, Elena had stood in the hallway for a long time, trying to remember the last time someone had defended her without expecting anything in return. She couldn't. The day before Adrian's arrival, Lydia had finally broken her silence. Elena had been in the music room, her music room, really, the one place in the house she'd claimed as her own, playing Beethoven badly because her hands were shaking with nerves. You're going to ruin everything. Elena's hands had crashed into the wrong keys. She'd turned to find Lydia in the doorway, still beautiful, still perfectly composed, but with something frantic in her eyes. I'm going to tell the truth, Elena had said. Those aren't the same thing. Truth? Lydia had laughed, but it had sounded harsh. You want to talk about truth? Fine. The truth is that I've worked for this. Months of letters, of being charming and interesting and everything he could want. I made him notice me. I made him care. You just stood there like a piece of furniture and expected him to fall in love with a ghost. I never asked him to fall in love with me. Exactly. You don't want him. You've never wanted him. So why are you doing this? Why can't you just let me have this one thing? Elena had stood from the piano bench slowly. One thing? Lydia, you've taken credit for every accomplishment I've had since we were children. The gardens, the charity work, the literary salon, even the Bloody Rose arrangements at your garden parties. You've built your entire identity on my work, and I let you because it was easier than fighting. But this? This is my future you're trying to steal. I'm not stealing it. I'm saving you from it. Lydia had stepped closer, her voice dropping. You think you'll be happy married to him? You, who can't make small talk at a dinner party? Who'd rather balance account books than attend a ball? He's a duke, Elena. His life is society and politics and everything you hate. I'd be doing you a favor. Then let me make that choice myself. I can't. And there it was, raw, desperate honesty. I can't go back to being just the pretty one, the one with no substance. I need this. I need to be someone who matters. For a moment, Elena had almost felt sorry for her. almost understood the desperation of a woman who'd been told her whole life that her value lay in her appearance and her ability to please. But then she'd remembered Mrs. Pemberton congratulating Lydia on an engagement that was Elena's, remembered her father choosing Lydia's happiness over Elena's legal right, remembered every time she'd stepped aside, made herself smaller, let someone else take what was hers. "You matter, Lydia," Elena had said quietly, "but not because you married well, not because you stole someone else's life. You matter because you exist. But you have to figure that out for yourself. I can't keep disappearing so you can feel real." Lydia's face had crumpled. "He's going to choose me anyway. You know that, don't you? Even if you tell him about the contract, even if you humiliate me, he's going to choose me, because I'm what men want. And you're what they settle for when they need someone to manage their estates." The words had landed like a physical blow. Elena had turned back to the piano, her hands finding the keys by memory. "Then you have nothing to worry about." She'd started playing again, and after a moment she'd heard Lydia leave, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Elena had played until her fingers ached, until the light faded and she had to strain to see the keys, until the notes blurred together into something that sounded less like music and more like grief. Adrian had arrived at noon the next day, his carriage rolling up the drive exactly on schedule. Elena had watched from her office window as Lydia rushed out to greet him, her dress a confection of spring green that made her look like a fairy tale princess. She'd seen Adrian step down from the carriage, seen him smile at Lydia, seen him offer his arm, and she'd felt nothing. No jealousy, no anger, just a strange, hollow certainty that she was about to blow her life apart, and there was no going back. She'd waited an hour before joining them in the drawing room, giving Lydia time to establish her territory. When she'd finally entered, she'd found exactly what she'd expected. Lydia holding court, Adrian listening with polite attention, her father beaming in the corner like a man who'd just won a horse race. "Elena!" Lord Whitlock had stood, his jovial tone so forced it could have shattered glass. "There you are. Come, join us. The Duke was just telling us about his journey. Uneventful, I'm afraid," Adrian had said, standing as well. His eyes had met Elena's, and something had flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. "Miss Elena, it's good to see you." "Your Grace." She'd curtsied properly, keeping her face neutral. "Please sit. I was hoping to speak with you as well." He'd gestured to a chair near his, but Lydia had smoothly intercepted. "Oh, Elena's probably exhausted. She's been working herself to the bone as usual. I keep telling her to rest more, but she never listens." Lydia had laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "So dedicated to the estate? We're lucky to have her." The "we" had been deliberate, possessive, as if Elena were staff. "Actually," Elena had said, and her voice had come out stronger than she'd expected, "I'd like to speak with His Grace privately, if that's acceptable." The room had gone silent. "Privately?" Her father's bonhomie had cracked. "I don't think that's necessary. I think it's essential." Elena had looked directly at Adrian. "There's a matter we need to discuss. About the betrothal agreement." Adrian's expression had shifted, becoming more focused. "Of course. Shall we use the library?" "The garden would be better." Elena had needed air for this. Needed space. "If you don't mind a brief walk." "I don't mind at all." Adrian surely... Lydia had started, but he'd cut her off gently. "This won't take long, Miss Lydia. Please excuse us." And just like that, they'd been alone. They'd walked in silence through the formal gardens, past the roses Elena had designed and Lydia had claimed, toward the eastern overlook where they'd stood once before in moonlight and half-truths. In daylight, it looked different, less romantic, more real. "You said there's a matter to discuss," Adrian had said finally, his tone careful, "about the betrothal." Elena had stopped walking, turned to face him. The wind had caught her hair, pulling strands loose from her careful bun, but she hadn't bothered to fix them. "Do you know who you're engaged to?" she'd asked. He'd blinked. What?" "It's a simple question. Who, specifically, is named in the betrothal contract your father signed with mine 16 years ago?" I assumed. He'd paused, and she'd watched understanding start to dawn. "You." "Me?" She'd pulled the contract from her pocket, unfolded it, held it out. Elena Charlotte Whitlock by name, not a daughter of suitable age, not whichever Whitlock girl catches your fancy. Me. Adrian had taken the document, read it quickly, and his face had gone very still. This is the original agreement. Signed and witnessed, legally binding, unless both parties agree to modify it, which you haven't. No. He'd looked up at her. No, I haven't, because I didn't know there was any confusion about who. He'd stopped, and something had shifted in his expression. The letters, the gifts. I sent them to the Whitlock family because I didn't want to appear presumptuous, but they were always meant for. Lydia thought they were for her. And you let her think that? His voice had held an edge now, something sharper than his usual courtesy. I let a lot of things happen, Elena had said, because it was easier than fighting, because I was tired, because part of me didn't want this anyway, and it seemed simpler to just step aside. And now? Now I'm here, telling you the truth, not because I'm in love with you, I barely know you, not because I want to hurt my sister, though this will, but because I spent my whole life being invisible, and I'm done. Adrian had folded his contract carefully, handed it back. What do you want me to do with this information? I want you to make an informed choice. If you want to marry Lydia, fine. We can dissolve the contract, you can court her properly, and I'll figure out my life. But if you proceed thinking she's who you were promised, thinking she's the one who's been managing this estate and answering your questions about agriculture and understanding the reality of the life you're offering, then you're marrying a fiction. And if I want to honor the original agreement, Elena's heart had stumbled. Then you should know what you're getting. I'm not easy. I'm not charming. I don't make people comfortable at parties. I work too much. I care too little about fashion. And I will absolutely try to reorganize your estate systems because I won't be able to help myself. That sounds. He'd smiled slightly. Honestly, that sounds refreshing. It sounds exhausting. Perhaps. But at least it's real. He'd stepped closer, and Elena had forced herself not to retreat. Can I ask you something? That night when I found you out here and asked if you wanted this, you said you didn't know. Do you know now? Did she? Elena had looked out over the estate, the fields she'd managed, the cottages she'd maintained, the land she'd kept alive through sheer stubborn competence. She'd built a life here in the margins, in the spaces no one else wanted, and now she was being offered something different. Visibility, partnership, a future that terrified her because it demanded she be seen. I know I don't want to disappear anymore, she'd said finally. The rest we'd have to figure out together, if you're willing. I think I'd like that. Adrian had held out his hand. Partners? She'd looked at his hand for a long moment, at the choice it represented, the risk, the possibility of something better than invisible competence. Then she'd taken it. Partners. They'd walked back to the house together, and Elena had felt like she was walking to her own execution, or her own coronation, or possibly both. The drawing room had been exactly as they'd left it. Lydia perched on the edge of her seat, her father attempting nonchalance, both of them radiating anxiety. Well, Lord Whitlock had said the moment they'd entered. Everything's settled? Not quite. Adrian had released Elena's hand, but stayed close beside her. Lord Whitlock, Miss Lydia, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. I apologize for any confusion my letters may have caused. Lydia had gone pale. What do you mean? I mean that my correspondence was intended for the family collectively because I was uncertain about the propriety of writing directly to my betrothed before our engagement was formally announced. But my betrothed, the woman named in the legal agreement between our families, is Elena. The silence that followed had been deafening. Then Lydia had laughed, a high, brittle sound. No, you're confused. The letters, the gifts, the compliments, those were for me. Elena doesn't even want to marry you. She said so herself. What I said, Elena had interjected quietly, was that I didn't know what I wanted. That's not the same as not wanting you, Adrian, and it's certainly not an invitation for someone else to take my place. You're lying. Lydia had stood, her composure cracking. You're lying because you're jealous, because for once in your life someone chose me over you, and you can't stand it. Lydia, enough. Their father had stood as well, but his authority had sounded hollow. His Grace has made his position clear. His position is wrong. He doesn't understand. Adrian, please just listen. I love you. I've loved you since your first letter. Elena doesn't love you. She loves her account books and her tenant disputes and her joyless, empty life. I can make you happy. I can be what you need. Adrian had looked genuinely distressed. Miss Lydia, I'm truly sorry if my actions led you to believe. Your actions? You wrote to me. You sent me poetry. You told me I was delightful. I wrote to the family. The poetry was Keats sent to a household I knew appreciated literature. And I said your company was delightful, which it was. That doesn't constitute a courtship. You're choosing her out of obligation. Lydia's voice had dropped to something desperate. The contract. That's all this is. But contracts can be broken. You can choose me. You can choose love over duty. I'm choosing honesty over illusion, Adrian had said, and his gentleness had somehow made it worse. I'm sorry. Lydia had turned to Elena then, and the look on her face had been pure venom. You did this. You poisoned him against me. You couldn't stand to see me happy, so you dragged out some dusty contract, and I showed him the truth, Elena had said. That's all. What he does with it is his choice. I'll never forgive you for this. Never. I know. And that had been it. Lydia had fled the room, her sobs echoing down the hallway. Their father had sunk back into his chair, looking suddenly old. Adrian had stood awkwardly in the middle of the drawing room, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. Elena had felt like she'd just survived a shipwreck. I should go to her, Lord Whitlock had said finally, but he hadn't moved. You should let her grieve, Elena had replied. She needs time. You've destroyed her. No, I've stopped propping her up. There's a difference. Her father had looked at her with something like hatred. I meant what I said. You do this. You marry him. You'll get nothing from me. The inheritance, the estate, it all goes to Lydia. The estate you've been bankrupting for years while I keep it running? That estate? Elena had felt something cold settle over her. Keep it. Give it to Lydia. See how long it lasts without me. She'd turned to Adrian. We should talk about what happens next. They'd ended up back in the library, surrounded by books and silence. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Elena had said, pouring herself a brandy with shaking hands. I'm sorry I caused it. Adrian had looked genuinely miserable. If I'd been clearer in my letters, Lydia would have found another way to convince herself. She's good at that. Elena had taken a drink, felt it burn. You should know what you're signing up for. My father's serious about the inheritance. If we marry, I'll have nothing but what you provide. No safety net, no escape route. You think you'll need an escape route? I think I'm very good at managing estates and very bad at everything else. I think you deserve to know that before we proceed. Adrian had been quiet for a moment. Then, can I tell you what I see when I look at you? That sounds dangerous, but proceed. I see someone who keeps an entire household running without recognition, who balances accounts and manages crises and makes decisions that affect hundreds of lives, all while her family treats her like furniture. I see someone who's strong enough to stand alone, but brave enough to ask for partnership. He'd paused. I see someone I'd like to know better. If you'll let me. Elena had set down her glass carefully because her hands had started shaking again. That's a very generous interpretation. It's an honest one. Honesty seems to be the theme of the day. Is that so bad? It's terrifying. She'd looked at him directly. I'm going to disappoint you. I don't know how to be the kind of wife a duke needs. I'll embarrass you at social functions. I'll argue with your steward. I'll probably try to reorganize your entire household in the first month. Please do. My household is a disaster. Despite everything, Elena had laughed. You're not taking this seriously. I'm taking it very seriously. I'm just choosing to focus on the possibilities instead of the problems. He'd crossed to where she stood. We have time, Elena. Time to figure this out. To build something real instead of performing something expected. Isn't that worth trying? Worth trying. As if she hadn't spent her entire life trying and failing and trying again. But maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time she'd be trying as herself instead of as whoever she thought she should be. Yes, she'd said, it's worth trying. The next week had been brutal. Lydia had locked herself in her room, refusing to see anyone. Their father had conducted a campaign of cold silence, speaking to Elena only when absolutely necessary. The servants had walked on eggshells. and Adrian had stayed at Thornfield, determinedly courteous in the face of the household's collapse. He'd asked Elena to show him the estate operations, all of them, the accounts, the tenant contracts, the maintenance schedules, the crisis management protocols she'd developed over years of keeping things running on a shoestring budget. "This is remarkable," he'd said, reviewing her system for tracking tenant payments and automatically flagging families who might need assistance before they fell into crisis. "How long have you been doing this?" "6 years, since my mother died and father started spending more time in London." "And your father doesn't see the value in this?" "My father sees that the estate functions and doesn't ask how." Elena had flipped to another page of the ledger. "He also doesn't know that I've been covering his gambling debts by renegotiating supplier contracts and cutting household expenses." Adrian had looked up sharply. "How much does he owe?" "Currently? About £3,000. I've managed to keep it from becoming a crisis, but it's getting worse." "And you've been handling this alone?" "Who else was there?" He'd studied her for a long moment. "You know, most women in your position would have used that information as leverage, threatened to expose him if he didn't support the engagement. Most women in my position wouldn't be allowed near the account books in the first place." Elena had closed the ledger. "Besides, what good would leverage do? He made his choice. Threatening him wouldn't change his heart." "No, but it might have protected you." "I don't need protection. I need honesty, even when it hurts." That evening, Adrian had requested a private dinner with just Elena. No Lydia, no Lord Whitlock, just the two of them in the small dining room. "I've made a decision," he'd said over the soup course, "about the engagement." Elena's stomach had dropped. "All right. I want to move forward, but I want to do it properly. Not because of a contract signed by our parents before we could walk, because we choose it." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we dissolve the old agreement and create a new one. One we write ourselves, with terms we both agree to." Elena had set down her spoon slowly. "You want to start over. I want to start honestly." "What do you need, Elena? Not what your father needs, not what society expects. What do you actually need from a marriage?" No one had ever asked her that. Not one once. She'd thought about it while the soup grew cold. "I need to matter. Not as a reflection of you, not as decoration, but as myself. I need work that challenges me, purpose, and I need—" She'd hesitated. "I need to know that if I fail, if I make mistakes, I won't become invisible again." "Done." He'd said it like it was simple. "What else?" "That's not enough." "I assume there's more." There was. Things she'd never said out loud because they'd seemed greedy or impossible. "I want to continue managing this estate even after we marry. I want involvement in your estate management. I want to be a partner, not a passenger." "Yes to all of it." Adrian had leaned forward. "Now I'll tell you what I need. I need honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong. I need a partner who actually wants to be there, not someone who's performing obligation." "That's fair." "And I need time to court you properly. Time for us to actually know each other before we legally bind ourselves together. Can you give me that?" Elena had looked at him across the table. This man who was offering her a choice instead of a cage. "How much time?" 6 months. A proper courtship. If at the end we both still want this, we marry. If not, we part as friends and I help you establish independence. Either way, you're not trapped." It had been more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd thought possible. 6 months, she'd agreed. They'd sealed it with a handshake, and Elena had felt something that might have been hope. But the household had other ideas. 3 days later, she'd been in her office when Mrs. Hartwell had appeared, her face grim. "Miss Elena, there's something you need to know." "What's wrong?" "It's Miss Lydia. She's been writing letters. To everyone. London society, families in the county, even some of His Grace's acquaintances." Elena's blood had gone cold. "Saying what?" "That you seduced the Duke. That you manipulated the situation to steal her fiancé. That you're—" Mrs. Hartwell had hesitated. "That you're unstable, dangerous. That your father is concerned for your well-being." "My father knows about this?" "She showed me his signature on one of the letters. Miss Elena, she's trying to destroy your reputation before you've even had a chance to establish the engagement." Elena had stood slowly, feeling something dark and angry unfurl in her chest. Where is she now? In the morning room, writing more letters. Elena had found Lydia exactly where Mrs. Hartwell had said, surrounded by cream-colored stationery and venomous prose. Elena! Lydia hadn't even had the grace to look guilty. Come to beg me to stop? Come to ask why? Why? Lydia had laughed. Because you took everything from me. So now I'll take everything from you. Your reputation, your engagement, your future. By the time I'm done, no one in society will receive you. Adrian will be forced to break the engagement to protect his own standing, and you'll be exactly where you belong, alone. Elena had walked to the desk, picked up one of the letters, read it. It was a masterpiece of subtle character assassination. Nothing overtly false, just implications and concerns and carefully worded doubts. This won't work, Elena had said. Won't it? Society loves a scandal, and I'm very good at telling them what they want to hear. Adrian won't believe it. Adrian's a duke. His reputation matters more than his feelings. When enough people start whispering, he'll have to act. You know that. And the worst part was she was probably right. Elena had set down the letter carefully. You could have been remarkable, you know, if you'd spent half the energy you use on manipulation on actually developing substance. Substance doesn't get you married. Beauty and charm do. You just refuse to accept that. No, I refuse to accept that those are the only things that matter. Elena had turned to leave, then paused. Send your letters, Lydia. Destroy my reputation. But know this, it won't make him love you. It'll just prove I was right about who you are. She'd left Lydia in the morning room, surrounded by her poison pen campaign, and gone directly to find Adrian. He'd been in the library, reading. We need to leave, Elena had said without preamble. What? Thornfield, we need to leave. Now. Today. She'd told him about the letters. All of it. Adrian's face had gone dangerously quiet. She's attempting to force my hand through social pressure. Yes. That's... He'd trailed off, looking genuinely shocked. That's remarkably calculated. That's Lydia. What do you want to do? And there it was again. The question. What did she want? Elena had looked around the library, at the house she'd kept alive, at the prison she'd built out of duty and silence. I want to leave. I want to start fresh somewhere she can't reach. She'd stopped, the words catching. I want to choose my own life for once. Adrian had stood, crossed to her, taken her hands. Then pack. We leave within the hour. My father can explain to his creditors why his competent daughter isn't available to clean up his messes anymore. It had felt like falling and flying at the same time. They'd left Thornfield that afternoon, Elena with one trunk, and Adrian's promise that she'd never have to go back. Behind them, Lydia had screamed threats from the front steps. Ahead of them, something terrifying and new and entirely their own. And for the first time in her life, Elena Whitlock wasn't invisible. She was free. The carriage wheels had barely cleared Thornfield's gates when Elena started shaking. Not visible tremors. Nothing Adrian could see from his seat across from her. Just an internal earthquake. A fundamental shift in her understanding of who she was and what she'd just done. She'd left. Actually left. Walked away from the only home she'd ever known with nothing but a hastily packed trunk, and a man she barely knew. Are you all right? Adrian asked, his voice careful. No. The honesty felt strange in her mouth. But I will be. She watched Thornfield disappear behind them through the carriage window, getting smaller with each turn of the wheels. Part of her expected to feel regret, or fear, or the sharp pain of loss. Instead, she felt lighter. Like she'd been carrying something heavy for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body, and someone had finally cut it loose. Where are we going? She asked. Greystone Manor, my estate. It's about 4 hours north. Adrian paused. I should warn you, it's not Thornfield. It's larger, older, and significantly more chaotic. My steward retired 6 months ago, and I've been managing alone. Badly. How badly? There's a leak in the east wing I haven't fixed because I can't find anyone who knows where the water's actually coming from. The tenant cottages need repairs, and I'm fairly certain my housekeeper is embezzling, but I haven't been able to prove it. Despite everything, Elena almost smiled. That sounds like a challenge. That sounds like a disaster waiting for someone competent to fix it. He met her eyes. Which is why I'm glad you're coming. The casual confidence in his voice, the assumption that she was competent, that her skills had value, made something twist in Elena's chest. She turned back to the window before he could see her face. They rode in silence for a while, the countryside rolling past in shades of spring green. Elena tried to think about practical things. What she'd need at Greystone, how to establish herself in a new household, the logistics of a 6-month courtship. But her mind kept returning to Lydia's face as they'd left, twisted with fury and something that might have been genuine pain. "Do you think I'm cruel?" she asked suddenly. Adrian looked startled. "What? Leaving like that? Not giving her a chance to, I don't know, to adjust, to understand?" "You gave her weeks to understand. She chose to write poison letters instead. She's still my sister. She's still the person who tried to destroy your future to protect her own fiction." Adrian's voice was gentle but firm. "Elena, you're allowed to choose yourself. That's not cruelty. That's survival." Elena wanted to believe him, but guilt was a habit she'd worn for so long it felt like skin. The landscape changed as they traveled north, flatter fields giving way to rolling hills, estates becoming larger and more imposing. When Greystone Manor finally came into view, Elena understood what Adrian had meant by larger. Thornfield could have fit in one wing. The main house was a sprawling Gothic structure of gray stone and mullioned windows, with 2 separate wings and what looked like a third building under construction in the distance. The grounds were extensive but clearly neglected. Overgrown gardens, weedy gravel drives, a fountain that had stopped working years ago. "It was my grandfather's obsession," Adrian said, watching her take it in. "He kept building and never stopped to maintain what he'd already built. My father tried to manage it, but he died young. I inherited at 23 with no idea what I was doing. And now? Now I have slightly more idea, but significantly less time." The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the main entrance. "Welcome to chaos." The household staff had assembled to greet them. About 30 people in various states of uniform, ranging from ancient to barely old enough to work. They looked confused, which made sense. Adrian had sent word ahead that he was returning with a guest, but probably hadn't mentioned that the guest was his unofficial betrothed who'd just fled her family home in dramatic fashion. "Everyone, this is Miss Elena Whitlock," Adrian announced as they climbed the front steps. "She'll be staying with us for the foreseeable future as my guest, and—" He paused, glancing at Elena. "As my partner in managing this estate. I expect you to extend her the same courtesy you would to me. Understood?" A murmur of assent rippled through the group. An older woman stepped forward, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her expression somewhere between suspicious and territorial. "Mrs. Dalton, Your Grace, head housekeeper. I wasn't informed we'd be having long-term guests. The blue room isn't prepared." "Then prepare it," Adrian said mildly. "Miss Whitlock will also need access to the estate office, the account books, and any household records you maintain." Mrs. Dalton's lips had thinned. "That's highly irregular." "So am I," Elena spoke before Adrian could defend her. "I understand this is unexpected, Mrs. Dalton, but I assure you I'm not here to disrupt your systems. I'm here to help." "We don't need help." "Then you're the first well-run estate in England." Elena kept her voice pleasant but firm. "But I suspect that's not true, or His Grace wouldn't have brought me here." They'd stared at each other for a long moment. 2 women who'd spent their lives managing households and dealing with people who underestimated them. Then Mrs. Dalton had given a barely perceptible nod. "I'll have the blue room ready within the hour." It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't war. Elena would take it. The blue room turned out to be a suite larger than Elena's entire bedroom at Thornfield. High ceilings, enormous windows overlooking the gardens, furniture that was expensive but clearly unused. It felt like a museum display, beautiful and cold. Elena unpacked mechanically, hanging the few dresses she'd brought, arranging her books on the escritoire by the window. She'd packed practically. Account ledgers, correspondence, the tools of her work at Thornfield. Only at the bottom of the trunk did she find the one thing she'd packed emotionally, her mother's music portfolio, filled with compositions she'd played 1,000 times. She set it aside carefully, not ready to confront that particular grief yet. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." A young maid entered, carrying a tea tray. She couldn't have been more than 16 with dark hair and nervous eyes. "Mrs. Dalton sent this, miss. Said you'd want tea after your journey." "That's kind of her." Elena gestured to the small table by the window. "What's your name?" "Mary, miss." "How long have you worked here, Mary?" "3 years, miss, since I was 13. She set down the tray with careful precision. "If you don't mind me saying, miss, we're glad you're here." Elena blinked. "Are you?" "Some of us are. The ones who actually work, not the ones who spend all day gossiping." Mary glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. "Things have been hard since Mr. Thornbury left. The old steward. His Grace tries, but he's gone so much, and Mrs. Dalton—" She caught herself. "I shouldn't speak ill of the housekeeper." "But you're going to anyway." A quick, nervous smile. "She runs the house like it's her own kingdom. Doesn't tell His Grace when things go wrong, just handles it her way, which usually means taking shortcuts and pocketing the difference." So Adrian's suspicions about embezzlement weren't unfounded. "Thank you for telling me, Mary. I'll look into it." "You won't mention I said anything?" "Not if you'd prefer I didn't." Relief flooded the girl's face. "Thank you, miss. Will you need anything else?" "Actually, yes. Can you tell me when dinner is served and whether I'm expected to dress formally?" 8 o'clock, miss. And His Grace usually dresses, but not formal, just—" She gestured vaguely at her uniform. "Nicer than daytime." After Mary left, Elena stood at the window, drinking tea and watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Somewhere below, Adrian was dealing with whatever crisis had accumulated in his absence. Somewhere behind them, Lydia was probably still writing letters, still spinning her narrative of betrayal. And Elena was here, in a strange house, about to tear apart someone else's household systems the same way she'd torn apart her own life. It felt terrifying and right in equal measure. Dinner was an education in Adrian's life. The dining room was absurdly large for 2 people, a table that could seat 40, paintings of disapproving ancestors on every wall, candlelight that created more shadows than illumination. Adrian sat at the head, Elena to his right, a wasteland of polished mahogany between them and any sense of intimacy. "This is ridiculous," Elena said, surveying the space. "I know, I usually eat in my study." "Why didn't you say so?" "Because Mrs. Dalton insists on proper dinners when there's a guest." He caught her expression. "Yes, I know I'm the Duke and I could simply tell her no. But pick your battles, right? That's how you lose wars." Adrian laughed, a real, genuine sound. "I'm beginning to see that. All right, new rule. From now on, we eat in the small dining room, the one that seats actual humans instead of entire parliamentary sessions." They'd moved, taking their plates and wine with them, leaving the servants confused but compliant. The small dining room was indeed smaller, though still grander than anything at Thornfield, but it felt less like performing and more like existing. "Better?" Adrian asked, refilling her wine. "Much." Elena cut into her roasted chicken. "Tell me about the estate. All of it. The problems you're avoiding, the crises you're managing, the things keeping you awake at night. That's dinner conversation?" "That's the only conversation that matters." So he told her about the leak that had started as a damp spot and was now actively destroying a ceiling, about the tenant farmers who'd been complaining for months about outdated equipment, about the coal mine on the northern border that was profitable but dangerous, and he couldn't figure out how to modernize it without bankrupting the estate, about the London townhouse he never used but couldn't sell because it was entailed, about the social obligations he hated but couldn't avoid, the balls and dinners and political maneuvering that came with his title. Elena listened, asked questions, made mental notes. This wasn't Thornfield's genteel decay. This was an empire crumbling under its own weight, and Adrian was trying to hold it together with willpower and ignorance. "You need help," she said finally. "I know. Real help. A new steward, competent staff, someone who understands large-scale estate management. I'm aware." He set down his fork. "I also need someone I can trust. And trust isn't something you can hire. No, but you can build it." Elena met his eyes across the table. "Give me a week. Let me look at your books, talk to your staff, understand the systems, then I'll tell you what I see. And if what you see is disaster, then at least it'll be an honest disaster." She paused. "Adrian, I need to ask, what exactly do you want from me? Partner in estate management? Yes. But what does that actually mean?" He'd considered this carefully. It means I want your opinion on major decisions, your insight on problems I can't solve alone, your honesty when I'm making mistakes. It means I want you to have real authority here, not just the appearance of it. That's going to upset people. People are already upset. Mrs. Dalton has been running this house like her personal fiefdom for 3 years. The tenants think I'm an absentee landlord. London society thinks I'm eccentric for managing my own estate instead of just collecting rents. He leaned forward. I don't particularly care about upsetting people who are already determined to be upset. I care about doing this right. Doing what right? All of it. The estate, the tenants, this. He gestured between them. Whatever we're building, I want it to be real, Elena. Not performance, not obligation. Real. The intensity in his voice had caught her off guard. She'd spent so long thinking of marriage as a transaction that the idea of it being genuine partnership felt foreign. I don't know how to be in a real relationship, she admitted. I've spent my whole life being useful, not wanted. I don't know how to be both. Neither do I, so we'll figure it out together. He raised his wine glass. To honest disasters? Elena clinked her glass against his. To honest disasters. The next morning, Elena started her investigation. She'd woken at dawn out of habit, dressed in her most practical gown, and headed straight for the estate office. It was locked. Of course it was. She'd tracked down Mrs. Dalton in the housekeeper's sitting room, interrupted what looked like a very leisurely breakfast, and requested the key. The estate office is His Grace's private domain, Mrs. Dalton had said, not moving. His Grace gave me explicit permission to access it. You were there when he said it. Permission to access, perhaps. But His Grace keeps the key himself. Then I'll ask him for it. He's gone to the North Fields to inspect the drainage issues. Won't be back until afternoon. They'd stared at each other across the housekeeper's sitting room, both knowing this was a test. Fine, Elena had said. I'll start elsewhere. I'd like to review your household accounts. Mrs. Dalton's expression had flickered. Those are in order. I'm sure they are. I'd still like to see them. I don't keep them in a format suitable for review. Then explain your system to me, and I'll take notes. Miss Whitlock, I've been managing this household for 3 years without interference. I don't need some jumped-up estate manager's daughter telling me how to do my job. The insult had been calculated, designed to put Elena in her place. At Thornfield, Elena would have absorbed it, smoothed it over, moved on. But she wasn't at Thornfield anymore. You're right, Elena had said, her voice deadly calm. You don't need me telling you how to do your job. You need His Grace telling you that your job is over. Because I'm going to find the discrepancies in your accounts, Mrs. Dalton. I'm going to document every shortcut, every missing pound, every time you prioritized your comfort over this estate's welfare. And when I do, you'll be dismissed without reference. Mrs. Dalton had gone pale. You can't. I can. Because unlike you, I actually know how to run a household honestly. And unlike His Grace, I don't have any sentimental attachment to staff who abuse their positions. Elena had stepped closer. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me those account books. You're going to cooperate with my review. And if you're very, very lucky, I'll find that your embezzlement was minor enough to simply dismiss you rather than prosecute. Do we understand each other? The housekeeper's hands had been shaking. His Grace won't allow this. His Grace hired me specifically to do this, but please test that theory. I'd enjoy watching you try. Mrs. Dalton had produced the account books. Elena had spent the next 6 hours going through them, and what she'd found had made her physically ill. The woman wasn't just embezzling, she was running an entire secondary economy through the estate, marking up supplier costs and pocketing the difference, billing for repairs that were never done, even taking a percentage of the servants' wages by claiming the estate couldn't afford full payment. The total, conservatively, was over £8,000 in 3 years. Elena had documented everything, cross-referenced it with supplier records she'd found in the office Adrian had finally opened for her, and compiled a report that would send Mrs. Dalton to prison if Adrian chose to prosecute. She'd been finishing the final page when Adrian had returned, muddy and exhausted. How was the drainage? She'd asked without looking up. Catastrophic. The whole system needs to be replaced. We're looking at... He'd stopped, taking in the disaster of papers surrounding her. What happened here? Mrs. Dalton has been stealing from you for 3 years. Elena had handed him the report. £8,000 minimum, possibly more. I need to cross-reference with the London household accounts, but I suspect she has a similar system running there. Adrian had read in silence, his face going progressively more grim. When he'd finished, he'd set the papers down carefully. "I'm going to be sick," he'd said. "Don't, it's not your fault. I hired her. I trusted her. I didn't—" He'd stopped, running his hands through his hair. £8,000. That's enough to fix the drainage, repair the cottages, modernize the equipment. Everything I've been telling tenants I can't afford because funds are tight. I know. And she just took it, while people suffered. Yes. Adrian had looked at Elena, and she'd seen something dangerous in his expression. I want her prosecuted, fully. No quiet dismissal, no second chances. I want her in front of a magistrate. Are you sure? It'll be a scandal. The household will be in chaos during the trial. I don't care. She stole from families who depend on this estate. That's not a mistake, that's cruelty. He'd stood. Where is she now? Probably in her rooms, packing. I may have told her this morning that she was done. You... He'd stopped, then laughed, but it had sounded slightly unhinged. You fired my housekeeper before consulting me? I told her I'd found her out. The firing seemed implied. Elena had met his eyes. Was I wrong? No, you were exactly right. He'd grabbed the report. Come with me. I want her to hear this from both of us. They'd found Mrs. Dalton in her sitting room, surrounded by half-packed trunks, her face red and tear-stained. Your Grace, please, I can explain. Explain £8,000? Adrian's voice had been ice. Explain stealing from families who can barely feed themselves? Please, Mrs. Dalton, I'm fascinated to hear this explanation. I was only trying to economize. The estate is so large and you're so rarely here. Don't. Elena had cut her off. I've seen your accounts. This wasn't economizing. This was systematic theft. You have no proof. Elena had dropped the ledger on the table with a thud. I have 3 years of proof, itemized, cross-referenced, and witnessed by your own hand. You signed these reports, Mrs. Dalton. You documented your own crimes. The woman had crumpled. Please, I'll return the money. Every penny. Just don't prosecute. I have family who depend on me. So do the people you stole from, Adrian had said. You're dismissed, effective immediately. You have 1 hour to leave the property. After that, I'm calling the magistrate. Your Grace, I'm begging you. 1 hour. They'd left her there, sobbing into her half-packed trunks. In the hallway, Elena had felt the adrenaline crash hit her. Her hands had started shaking again. That same internal earthquake she'd felt leaving Thornfield. That was brutal, she'd said. That was necessary. Adrian had stopped walking, turned to face her. Elena, are you all right? I just destroyed a woman's life. She destroyed it herself. You just documented the damage. It doesn't feel that simple. It isn't. He'd taken her shaking hands in his. But it's right. And sometimes right feels terrible. That doesn't make it less right. Elena had looked at their joined hands, at this man who'd given her authority and trusted her to use it, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not love. It was too soon for that, too fragile. But maybe the beginning of it. The possibility. We need a new housekeeper, she'd said. We need a lot of things, starting with someone to actually run this household while we fix everything else. He'd paused. Any ideas? Mrs. Hartwell. Your housekeeper from Thornfield? Former housekeeper. She was loyal, competent, and she actually liked me. If we can steal her away from my father, consider her stolen. I'll write today. They'd stood there in the hallway, still holding hands, while the household erupted into chaos around them. Servants whispering, Mrs. Dalton sobbing echoing through the corridors, the whole carefully maintained facade of order crumbling. And Elena had felt, for the first time in her life, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next week had been chaos. Mrs. Dalton had left under threat of prosecution, taking only what she could carry and leaving behind a household in complete disarray. Half the staff had quit in solidarity, or possibly fear that their own small corruptions would be discovered. The remaining servants had looked at Elena like she was either their savior or their executioner, depending on whose side they'd been on. Adrian had thrown himself into damage control, meeting with tenants to explain the situation and assure them that stolen funds would be recovered and used for long-delayed improvements. Elena had taken over temporary household management, which was like trying to conduct an orchestra where half the musicians had never seen their instruments before. And through it all, Lydia's letters had started arriving. The first one had come 3 days after they'd left Thornfield, addressed to Adrian in Lydia's careful script. He'd opened it at breakfast, read 2 lines, and handed it to Elena without comment. "My dearest Adrian," it had begun, and Elena's stomach had turned. "I write to you in the desperate hope that you have not yet realized the terrible mistake you've made. My sister, whom I love despite her faults, is not well. Her obsession with control, her inability to form genuine human connections, her cold manipulation of every situation, these are signs of a troubled mind. I fear she has deceived you, as she has deceived our father and myself for years." It had gone on for 3 pages, a masterpiece of concerned sister manipulation, suggesting everything without stating anything actionable. "She's good," Elena had said, setting it down. "She's desperate." Adrian had returned to his eggs. "I'm not responding. She'll escalate. Let her." But Lydia had escalated, sending letters to Adrian's friends, his business associates, even his godmother. Letters full of worry and veiled suggestions that Elena was unstable, manipulative, possibly even dangerous. That Adrian was being controlled by a woman who'd spent years dominating her own family through fear and competence. The worst part was how close to truth it danced. Elena had controlled Thornfield through competence. She was manipulative when necessary, and there was a part of her that was absolutely capable of cruelty in service of what she thought was right. "Does any of this bother you?" she'd asked Adrian one evening, after another batch of letters had arrived. They'd been in his study, reviewing the tenant contracts Elena had found buried in Mrs. Dalton's files. Adrian had set down the letter he'd been reading, this one from his godmother, suggesting he slow down and reconsider his hasty attachment to a woman of uncertain temperament. "Does it bother me that your sister is waging a letter-writing campaign to destroy you?" "Yes." "Does it make me question you?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I've watched you work for 2 weeks now. I've seen how you treat servants, how you approach problems, how you handle power. You're not cruel, Elena. You're honest. And sometimes honesty looks like cruelty to people who've built their lives on comfortable lies." "That's very generous." "It's accurate." He'd leaned back in his chair. "Besides, if I let Lydia's letters influence me, I'm exactly the kind of weak-minded fool she's betting on. And I'm not that. Neither are you. But the letters had kept coming, and with them, social consequences. Invitations that should have arrived at Greystone stopped coming. Families that Adrian had been friendly with went suddenly quiet. At the local assembly, whispers had followed Elena like smoke, nothing concrete enough to confront, just the steady erosion of reputation. "We could go to London," Adrian had suggested one evening. "Face this head on. Let society see you as you are, not as Lydia's painting you. Or we could stay here and do the work that matters." Elena had been reviewing the budget for the cottage repairs, trying to stretch recovered funds far enough. "I don't need society's approval. But you might need their cooperation. I have business in Parliament next session. Connections matter." "Then go. I'll stay here and keep things running." "Elena, I mean it. I don't want to perform for people who've already decided what they think of me. I want to fix drainage systems and renegotiate tenant contracts and figure out how to make this estate actually sustainable." She'd looked up from her papers. "That's what I'm good at. Let me do it." Adrian had studied her for a long moment. "You're running away." "I'm choosing my battles." "You're letting Lydia win." The words had stung because they were partially true. Elena was avoiding confrontation, the same way she'd avoided it at Thornfield. But this felt different. This felt like choosing where to spend her energy instead of letting other people's expectations dictate her choices. "Maybe I am," she'd said, "but I'm also building something real here, and I won't abandon that to chase Lydia's ghost through London ballrooms." He'd nodded, but she'd seen the concern in his eyes. The question, was she building something real or just building a new cage? That night, Elena had played piano for the first time since arriving at Greystone. There was an old instrument in the music room, a beautiful rosewood piece that was painfully out of tune, but still functional. She'd found it by accident, looking for a quiet place to think after dinner. She'd sat down, run her fingers over the keys, and played her mother's favorite composition, a Chopin nocturne that she'd learned at 14 and never forgotten. The music had poured out of her, messy and emotional, and absolutely nothing like the technically perfect performances Lydia used to give. Elena played with her eyes closed, feeling every note in her chest, not caring if anyone heard, not performing for anyone. When she'd finished, Adrian had been standing in the doorway. "I didn't know you played like that," he'd said quietly. "I don't. Not usually." Elena had kept her hands on the keys. "Usually I'm too conscious of how I look, how I sound, but tonight I needed this." He'd crossed the room, sat beside her on the bench. "Play something else." "It's out of tune." "I don't care." So she'd played. Beethoven, Mozart, a folk song her mother used to sing. She'd played until her fingers ached and her throat was tight with unshed tears, and Adrian had sat beside her the entire time, just listening. When she'd finally stopped, he'd said, "This is who you are. Not the competent estate manager, not the woman everyone underestimated. This. Someone who feels things so deeply you have to close your eyes to survive it." Elena had looked at him, and something had cracked open inside her chest. "I don't know how to be her and also be useful." "You don't have to choose, you can be both." "Can I?" Instead of answering, he'd kissed her. It had been unpracticed, slightly awkward, nothing like the romantic ideal she'd never let herself imagine. His hand had been uncertain on her face, her response delayed by surprise. But it had been real, messy and honest and absolutely terrifying. When they'd broken apart, Elena had been shaking again, but this time it hadn't felt like fear. "Was that all right?" Adrian had asked, and the vulnerability in his voice had nearly broken her. "Yes. Yes." They'd sat there on the piano bench, not quite touching, both of them breathing too hard, while the out-of-tune piano settled back into silence around them. Then the door had crashed open, and a footman had appeared, white-faced and panicked. "Your Grace, Miss Whitlock, there's a fire in the East Wing." They'd run. The East Wing had been where the leak was, where Adrian had been avoiding repairs because the problem seemed impossible to solve. Now it was where flames were consuming the ceiling, fed by years of water damage and rotted wood. Servants were already forming bucket lines, but it was clear they were losing. The fire was spreading faster than they could contain it, jumping from room to room through the connected corridors. "Get everyone out!" Adrian had shouted. "Clear the wing completely!" Elena had grabbed a bucket, joined the line, worked until her arms screamed and her lungs burned with smoke. She'd watched Adrian coordinate evacuation, watched him risk his own safety to make sure every servant was accounted for, watched the east wing of his family's estate burn despite everything they were doing. By the time the fire had burned itself out, consuming everything flammable and stopping only when it reached the stone walls separating the east wing from the main house, it was nearly dawn. They'd stood in the courtyard covered in soot and ash, watching smoke still rising from what remained. "That was the portrait gallery," Adrian had said, his voice hollow. 4 generations of family history. Gone. Elena had taken his hand, squeezed. "I'm sorry. The irony is, I was going to demolish that wing anyway. It was too damaged to save, too expensive to repair. The fire just made the decision for me." He'd laughed, but it had sounded broken. "At least insurance will cover it." "Adrian, it's fine. It's just things. Just history. He'd stopped, his voice cracking. "It's fine." It hadn't been fine. Elena had seen it in every line of his body, in the way he couldn't look at the ruins, in the careful neutrality of his tone. She'd stepped in front of him, forced him to meet her eyes. "It's not fine. Your family's history just burned. You're allowed to grieve that." "I should be grateful everyone got out alive." "You can be grateful and sad at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive." She'd kept her voice soft but firm. "Adrian, I know what it's like to perform competence when everything's falling apart. You don't have to do that with me." And there, in the courtyard, surrounded by exhausted servants and smoking ruins, Adrian Vale had finally let himself break. He'd cried quietly, his face pressed against Elena's shoulder while she'd held him and pretended not to notice the way her own tears were mixing with the soot on her face. When he'd finally pulled back, he'd said, "How do you do this? How do you keep going when everything falls apart?" "I don't know," Elena had admitted. "I've never had anyone to fall apart with before." I've always had to be the one holding everything together. And now? Now we take turns. She'd wiped ash from his face with her equally filthy hand. Today you break. Tomorrow maybe I will, and somehow we'll keep this disaster from burning down completely. He'd kissed her again, desperate and grateful and tasting like smoke. And Elena had kissed him back, thinking that maybe this was what real partnership looked like. Two people too broken to be perfect, choosing each other anyway. The sun had risen on the smoking ruins of the East Wing, on a household in chaos, on an estate teetering on financial collapse. And standing in the wreckage, Elena Whitlock had realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to make herself smaller to fit someone else's expectations. She was standing at her full height, holding a man who saw her completely, in the ruins of everything they were trying to build. It should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something real. The morning after the fire, Elena woke to find Adrian already gone from the breakfast table. A note sat beside her plate in his precise handwriting. Meeting with insurance assessor, back by noon. Don't burn down the other wing while I'm gone. She'd smiled despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. Then she'd finished her tea and gone to work. The East Wing was unsalvageable. Everyone could see that. But what most people weren't seeing was the opportunity buried in the ash. Elena stood in the ruined corridor, notebook in hand, sketching plans while smoke still drifted through broken windows. Miss Elena, you shouldn't be in here. Thomas, the head groundskeeper, had appeared behind her, his weathered face creased with concern. The structure's not safe. The structure's stone. It'll hold. She gestured to the exposed beams overhead. Look at this. The fire revealed the original support system. See how they built it? That's 14th century engineering. Your grandfather's additions just covered it up with cheaper materials that couldn't handle the moisture. Thomas had squinted upward. Suppose that's true. What of it? What of it is that we don't need to demolish and rebuild. We need to strip away the rot and return to the original structure. It'll cost a fraction of what Adrian thinks, and the building will actually be sounder than it was before. You sure about that? No, but I'm going to find out. She turned to face him fully. Thomas, I need complete inventories. Every room in this wing, what burned, what survived, what was worth keeping in the first place. Can you handle that? He'd studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and immediately started dismantling their former housekeeper's empire of petty theft. Then he'd nodded slowly. I can handle it. Good. I need it by tomorrow. That's, He'd caught himself. Tomorrow. Yes, miss. She'd spent the rest of the morning crawling through the ruins, taking measurements, testing stone integrity, making notes that would have horrified any proper lady. By the time Adrian returned, she was covered in soot again and standing knee-deep in charred debris. You're supposed to be resting, he'd called from the doorway, reluctant to enter the unstable structure. I'm supposed to be useful. Come look at this. He'd picked his way through the wreckage to where she stood. The assessor says we're looking at complete demolition. 12,000 pounds minimum. The assessor is wrong. Look. She'd pointed to the exposed wall. This is original stonework, solid as the day it was built. Everything that burned was just cosmetic, plaster, wood paneling, decorative elements your grandfather added. Strip it all away, restore the medieval structure, and you've got something actually worth having. You want to turn my East Wing into a castle? I want to stop throwing money at covering up problems instead of solving them. She'd met his eyes. How much did the assessor quote for restoration? 8,000 to make it habitable in the current style. I can do it for 4, and it'll last another 600 years instead of rotting again in 20. Adrian had laughed, but it had been slightly wild. You've been here 2 weeks, and you're already redesigning my house. You told me to fix it, I'm fixing it. She gestured to her notes. But I need your approval. This is your home, your family legacy. If you want traditional restoration, I understand. But if you want something better, I want something that won't burn down again because I was too proud to admit I couldn't manage it alone. He'd looked around at the ruins, then back at her. 4,000 pounds. Are you certain? I'm certain it's possible. Whether I can actually pull it off is a different question. That's honest. That's all I have. He'd kissed her then, quick and decisive, tasting like ash and trust. Do it. Whatever you need, labor, materials, authority, you have it. Just build me something real. So she had. The next month was a controlled demolition of everything inauthentic. Elena had hired local stonemasons, men who knew medieval construction because they'd been repairing the village church for generations. She'd stripped away the rotted additions, exposed the original architecture, and discovered that beneath the decay was something magnificent. The servants had watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as she'd worked alongside the laborers, her dresses perpetually stained with dust and mortar. The few remaining household staff who'd survived Mrs. Dalton's exodus had started calling her the Duchess who wasn't, said with equal parts respect and uncertainty. Mrs. Hartwell had arrived from Thornfield in the third week, took one look at the chaos, and immediately started organizing it. "Good heavens, Elena," she'd said, surveying the construction site that used to be a wing of the manor. "What have you gotten yourself into?" "Saving money and historical architecture, possibly destroying my reputation in the process." "Your reputation was already destroyed, dear. Might as well make it worthwhile." Mrs. Hartwell had set down her bags. "Now, where's this kitchen I'm supposed to be reorganizing?" With Mrs. Hartwell managing the household and Elena managing the construction, Greystone had begun to transform. Not just the East Wing, but the entire estate. They'd renegotiated supplier contracts using the same tactics Elena had employed at Thornfield. They'd implemented the tenant assistance program Elena had designed. They'd fixed the drainage system in the North Fields, repaired the cottages, even started modernizing the coal mine with safety equipment that would pay for itself in reduced injuries. The estate had started making money, actual profit, not just barely covering expenses. And people had noticed. The first sign had come in the form of a visit from Lord Pemberton, a neighboring landowner who'd ignored every letter Adrian had sent for months. "Heard you've got some new management strategies," he'd said, accepting tea in the study. "My steward's curious about your tenant assistance program. Claims it's actually increasing productivity." Adrian had glanced at Elena, who'd been seated quietly in the corner, theoretically just observing. "Miss Whitlock developed that program. You should ask her." Pemberton had looked uncomfortable. "I'd heard she was involved." "She's not involved. She's running it." Adrian's voice had been pleasant but firm. "Everything you've heard about improvements at Greystone, that's Elena's work." "I see." Pemberton had turned to Elena with obvious reluctance. "Perhaps you could explain the basic principles?" Elena had set down her teacup and explained. Not simplified, not dumbed down. The actual economic theory behind supporting tenants during hardship to prevent the cascading failures that cost estates far more in the long run. She'd used numbers, examples, projections. She'd made it impossible to dismiss as feminine sentiment. Pemberton had listened with increasing attention. By the time she'd finished, he'd been taking notes. "That's actually brilliant," he'd admitted. "I've been approaching it completely wrong. Most people do. They see tenant assistance as charity. It's not. It's investment. Would you be willing to review my estate's tenant contracts? I'd compensate you for your time, of course." Adrian had nearly choked on his tea. Elena had kept her expression neutral. "I'd be happy to. Send them over next week." After Pemberton had left, Adrian had turned to her with something like awe. "Did that just happen? Did Lord Pemberton just ask you for professional advice?" "He asked his neighbor's peculiar lady friend for help because he's desperate and she seems to know what she's doing. That's not exactly respect." "It's a start." And it had been. Word had spread. Not through London society, where Lydia's letters still circulated like poison, but through the networks that actually mattered for estate management. Landowners talked to their stewards talked to each other, and slowly, grudgingly, people had started asking questions about the woman who'd apparently turned Greystone from a money pit into a profitable enterprise in 6 weeks. Elena had started receiving correspondence, requests for advice, questions about specific problems, even a few offers of employment from estates whose owners had heard about her skills. She'd answered them all honestly, helping where she could, admitting ignorance where she couldn't, and something strange had started happening. She'd begun to build a reputation that had nothing to do with scandal or stolen engagements. She'd become known as someone who knew estate management, who could solve impossible problems, who treated the work with the seriousness it deserved. It hadn't been the reputation she'd expected, but it had been real. The confrontation with Lydia had come in the 8th week, just when Elena had started to believe they might escape without one. She'd been in the reconstructed East Wing, consulting with the head mason about window placement, when a footman had appeared looking panicked. "Miss Elena, there's a lady here. Says she's your sister. She's asking for his grace, but he's in the village, and Mrs. Hartwell said I should fetch you first." Elena's stomach had dropped. "Where is she?" "The drawing room. She arrived with 2 trunks and a maid. Looks like she's planning to stay." Of course she was. Elena had found Lydia exactly where she'd expected, positioned in the drawing room's best chair, arranged to look both beautiful and wounded, her dress a statement of expensive grief. "Hello, Lydia." Her sister had looked up, and her expression had been hard to read. "Elena, or should I say Miss Whitlock? I'm not sure what the proper address is for someone living in sin with a duke." "I'm not living in sin. I'm living in the guest wing, with a chaperone." Mrs. Hartwell had insisted on that, properly scandalized despite her loyalty. "What are you doing here?" "I came to see my sister. Is that so strange?" "Yes, especially after 2 months of letters designed to destroy me." Lydia had flinched slightly. "Those letters were... I was upset, hurt. You stole my future. I reclaim mine. Not the same thing, isn't it?" Lydia had stood, and Elena had seen that she'd lost weight, her face thinner, her eyes shadowed. "You took the one thing I wanted and left me with nothing. Father's furious with both of us now. Did you know that? Your absence exposed how badly the estate was being managed. He's hemorrhaging money, and there's no one to fix it because you're here playing Duchess." "I'm not playing anything. I'm working." "So I've heard. Everyone's heard." Lydia's voice had turned bitter. "The brilliant Elena Whitlock, saving estates and solving impossible problems. They talk about you at every dinner party now, not as a scandal, as a curiosity, a woman who's somehow more useful than decorative. Is that why you're here? To tell me I'm being talked about?" "I'm here because Father sent me, to beg you to come back." Elena had gone very still. "What?" "Thornfield's failing, actually failing. The tenants are in revolt, the suppliers won't extend credit, and there's some legal issue with the western boundary that no one understands except apparently you." Lydia had looked away. "He needs you. He won't say it. He's too proud. But I will. We need you. You sent letters to half of London calling me unstable and manipulative. Now you want me to come home and save Father's estate. Do you hear how insane that sounds?" "I know." Lydia's voice had been small. "I know it's insane, but I don't know what else to do. Everything's falling apart, and She'd stopped, and when she'd looked back at Elena, her eyes had been wet. "I can't hold it together. I don't know how. I never learned because you were always there doing it for me." The honesty had been unexpected. Elena had stood there looking at her sister, this beautiful, terrible person who'd spent months trying to destroy her, and felt something complicated that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite hatred either. "I'm not coming back to Thornfield," she'd said finally. "Elena, please, but I'll help. Remotely. Send me the legal documents about the boundary dispute. Send me the tenant contracts and the supplier agreements. I'll review them, tell you what needs to be done. But I won't come back to that house. I won't put myself back in a place where my work is invisible and my presence is resented." Lydia had looked like she wanted to argue. Then her shoulders had sagged. "That's more than I deserve." "Yes, it is. I'm sorry." The words had come out rushed, desperate. "I'm sorry for the letters, for the lies, for all of it. I was so angry, and I thought if I could just make everyone see you the way I did, as someone cold and calculating and I am cold," Elena had interrupted. "I am calculating. I make decisions based on logic instead of emotion. Those things aren't flaws, Lydia. They're just different from what you value. But you're not cruel. I said you were cruel, and that was wrong. You were half right. I can be cruel when necessary. I fired Mrs. Dalton knowing it would destroy her life. I left Thornfield knowing it would expose Father's mismanagement. I made choices that hurt people." Elena had stepped closer. "The difference is, I did it consciously, with full knowledge of the consequences. You did it unconsciously, thinking you were the victim the whole time. I was a victim of your competence, of your ability to do everything I couldn't. No, you were a victim of your own fear that being beautiful wasn't enough." Elena had kept her voice gentle but firm. And you were right to be afraid because it isn't enough. But instead of developing substance, you tried to steal mine. That's not my fault, Lydia. That's yours. Lydia had been crying openly now, and Elena had felt something inside her chest crack. Not break. She'd done too much breaking already. But crack. Making room for something more complicated than anger. I don't know how to be anything else, Lydia had whispered. Then learn. You're 22. You have time to become someone real instead of someone performed. Elena had pulled out a handkerchief, handed it to her sister. But you have to do it yourself. I can't keep propping you up. I can't keep making you look good while disappearing myself. I'm done with that. What am I supposed to do? Go home. Run Thornfield. Actually run it, not just smile and delegate. Learn the accounts, meet the tenants, solve the problems. I'll help you, but I won't do it for you. Not anymore. Lydia had wiped her eyes, looking young and lost. I'll fail. Probably, but you'll learn from it. That's how competence works. They'd stood there in the drawing room, two sisters who'd spent their lives in different kinds of cages, finally seeing each other clearly. Does he make you happy? Lydia had asked suddenly. Adrian? I don't know yet. We're still figuring out what this is. But he sees you, really sees you. Yes. I'm glad. And Lydia had sounded like she meant it. You deserve that, even if I tried to take it away. Adrian had returned an hour later to find both Whitlock sisters in the drawing room, drinking tea and discussing crop rotation with the stilted formality of people trying to build something new on scorched ground. Should I be concerned? He'd asked from the doorway. Probably, Elena had said. But Lydia's leaving tomorrow. She just came to... She'd glanced at her sister. To apologize, Lydia had finished, and to ask for help I don't deserve. Adrian had looked between them, clearly trying to assess the threat level. And Elena said, I said I'd help, with conditions. That sounds appropriate. He'd crossed to Elena, touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture of support and solidarity. Will you be staying for dinner, Miss Lydia? If that's not too much trouble. It's fine. Though I should warn you, we eat in the small dining room now, Elena's rule. Because the formal dining room is absurd for 3 people, Elena had added. Because everything about this house was absurd until you arrived and started fixing it, Adrian had corrected. He'd looked at Lydia. Fair warning, dinner conversation here involves estate management, construction updates, and detailed discussions of agricultural economics. It's not polite society. Good, Lydia had said quietly. I'm tired of polite society. Dinner had been strange. 3 people who should have been enemies, navigating toward something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't war either. Lydia had asked questions about the East Wing restoration, actually listened to the answers. Adrian had been careful not to exclude her, but also made it clear where his loyalties lay. And Elena had found herself explaining things she'd only ever thought about in her own head, making her knowledge accessible to someone who'd never cared about these things before. You're really good at this, Lydia had said at one point, watching Elena sketch drainage plans on a napkin to illustrate a point about water management. I never realized. I mean, I knew you managed things at home, but I thought it was just, I don't know, organizing. I didn't understand it was this. This? Real, important, like what men do, except you're better at it than most of them. That's not a high bar, Adrian had interjected dryly. Most men I know couldn't manage a household budget if their lives depended on it. But they don't have to, Elena had said. They have wives and mothers and sisters doing it invisibly, while they take credit for everything running smoothly. Not anymore, Adrian had raised his wine glass. At least not here. After dinner, Lydia had pulled Elena aside in the hallway. I'm going to fix the letters, the ones I sent. I'm going to write to everyone and tell them I was wrong, that I was hurt and lashing out, and that that everything I said was lies. That'll destroy what's left of your reputation. I know, but it's the right thing to do. Lydia had smiled weakly. You'd be proud. I'm finally choosing honesty over image. I am proud. But Lydia, you don't have to destroy yourself to repair what you broke. Just tell the truth going forward. Let your actions rebuild your reputation instead of your words tearing down mine. That'll take longer. Yes, but it'll be real. Lydia had hugged her then, impulsively, desperately, the way she used to when they were children and something had frightened her. and Elena had hugged back, feeling the sharp edges of resentment start to smooth into something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. Lydia had left the next morning with promises to send the Thornfield documents and actual tears when she'd said goodbye. Elena had watched the carriage disappear down the drive and felt something shift inside her, the final severing of the cord that had kept her tied to her old life. "You all right?" Adrian had asked, coming to stand beside her. "I think so. It's strange. I spent months hating her, and now I just feel sad, tired, sad, maybe a little hopeful that she'll actually change." Elena had turned to face him. "Is that naive?" "Maybe, but it's also generous. That's not a bad thing." He'd taken her hand. "Come on, the Masons are waiting for your approval on the window designs." They'd walked back to the East Wing together, and Elena had marveled at how normal it had started to feel, this life, this work, this partnership they were building. The restoration had been completed in the 10th week, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and £300 under budget. The East Wing had been transformed from a monument to decay into something stunning: exposed stone walls, high vaulted ceilings, windows that let in actual light instead of filtering it through heavy drapes. It looked medieval and modern at the same time, old enough to matter and new enough to function. Adrian had stood in the center of the main hall, turning slowly to take it all in. "This is remarkable." "This is what it always should have been," Elena had corrected. "We just removed the parts that were covering up the truth." "Is that what we're doing? Removing parts? In construction?" "Yes." "In life?" She'd looked at him. "Also yes. You stopped performing the absentee nobleman. I stopped performing the invisible manager. We removed the parts that weren't real." "And what's left?" "I'm still figuring that out." He'd crossed to where she stood, took both her hands. They'd been standing there for weeks now, not quite engaged, not quite courting in any traditional sense, but building something real in the spaces between official definitions. "I want to ask you something," Adrian had said, "and I need you to be completely honest." "I'm always honest with you." "Good. Then tell me, are you happy here?" The question had caught her off guard. Happy. She'd spent so long focused on useful, on productive, on necessary, that she'd forgotten to check if any of it made her happy. "Yes," she'd said, and realized it was true. "I'm happy. I'm exhausted and covered in construction dust half the time, and probably destroying my reputation beyond repair, but yes, I'm happy." "Then marry me." Elena's heart had stopped. "What?" "Marry me. Not because of a contract or an obligation, or because society expects it. Marry me because we work, because you make me better and I make you— I don't know, maybe I don't make you better, but I make you feel seen, and that seems to matter to you." "Adrian, we agreed on 6 months. I know what we agreed. I'm asking you to change the agreement. We can still take the time, still build what we're building. But I want it to be with the certainty that this is real, that we're choosing each other." He'd squeezed her hands. "Unless you don't want that. In which case, tell me now, and we'll proceed as planned." Elena had looked at him. This man who'd given her authority and space and trust, who'd stood beside her while she'd burned down social conventions and rebuilt something honest from the ashes. This man who kissed her like she was precious and argued with her about agricultural policy and let her play piano with her eyes closed. "Yes," she'd said. "Yes, you'll marry me. Or yes, you'll tell me if you don't want to." "Yes, I'll marry you, you idiot." He'd kissed her then, properly this time, with the kind of certainty that came from actual choice rather than obligation. And Elena had kissed him back, thinking that maybe this was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of commitment, but the presence of choice. The announcement had appeared in the London papers 3 days later. The Duke of Vale to wed Miss Elena Whitlock, eldest daughter of Lord Christopher Whitlock of Thornfield Estate. The wedding will take place at Greystone Manor in September. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. The response had been immediate and divided. Half of society had been scandalized. Whispers about the haste, the irregularity, the fact that Elena had been living at Greystone for months with barely adequate chaperoning. The other half had been curious, particularly those who'd heard about her work on the estate and wanted to know if the rumors were true. Lydia's retraction letters had arrived at the same time, carefully worded admissions that she'd been mistaken in her earlier correspondence, that her sister was actually quite competent and not at all unstable. They'd done some damage control, though not enough to fully repair what she'd broken. But Elena had found she didn't care as much as she'd thought she would. Let London society whisper. She had work to do. The real response had come from Lord Pemberton, who'd appeared at Greystone 2 days after the announcement with a proposal. "I want to hire you," he'd said without preamble. "As a consultant, I've implemented your tenant assistance program and seen a 15% increase in productivity. I want you to review my entire operation. I'm not qualified to—" "You're more qualified than anyone I've met, including the so-called experts from London who charge a fortune and provide useless advice." He'd set a contract on Adrian's desk. £500 for a complete estate audit and recommendations. More if you implement the changes yourself. Elena had looked at Adrian, who'd been trying not to smile. "It's your decision." "This is insane. I'm about to become a duchess. Duchesses don't consult on estate management." "This duchess does," Adrian had said, "if she wants to." Elena had picked up the contract, read it carefully. It had been professional, serious, offering real money for real work. Not charity, not indulgence. Actual employment based on demonstrated competence. "I'll do it," she'd said. "But I need 2 conditions added. 1, I maintain final approval on all recommendations. I won't have my work implemented incorrectly and blamed for the results. 2, any tenant families displaced by efficiency improvements get 6 months support to retrain or relocate. No exceptions." Pemberton had nodded immediately. "Done. When can you start?" "After the wedding. I have my own estate to finish first." After he'd left, Adrian had turned to Elena with something like pride in his expression. "You know what you just did? Agreed to more work when I already have too much? You just became the first woman I know to negotiate professional terms as an equal, not as someone's daughter or wife, but as yourself." "I'm about to be your wife." "Yes. But that's not why Pemberton hired you. He hired you because you're brilliant at this, and he knows it." Adrian had crossed to her, pulled her into his arms. "You're going to change things, Elena. Not just here, not just for us. You're going to show people that women can do this work as well as men. Better, even." "That's a lot of pressure." "That's reality, and you're exactly stubborn enough to make it work." She'd kissed him, thinking that maybe he was right. Maybe she was building something bigger than just one estate, one life, one choice. Maybe she was building proof that invisible women could become impossible to ignore. The wedding planning had been deliberately simple. No grand London ceremony. No elaborate guest lists. No performance of social expectation. Just family, close friends, and the people who actually mattered to their lives. They'd hold it at Greystone, in the newly restored East Wing, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together. Lydia had written asking if she could attend. Elena had written back, "Yes, but only if you're coming as my sister, not as a performance of reconciliation." Lydia's response had been brief. "I'll come as myself," whoever that turns out to be. 2 weeks before the wedding, a letter had arrived from Lord Whitlock. Elena had opened it with shaking hands, expecting anger or demands or some final attempt to control her choices. Instead, she'd found something unexpected: capitulation. "My dear Elena," it had read, "I have made many mistakes as your father, not least of which was failing to see your value until you were gone. Lydia has explained the situation with more honesty than I expected from her. I see now that I favored beauty over substance, performance over competence, and in doing so, I lost the daughter who actually kept my household functioning. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I want you to know that I am proud of what you have accomplished. Even if I played no role in helping you achieve it, your mother would have been proud as well. I hope you will allow me to attend your wedding, not as the man who failed you, but as the father trying to do better. Your servant, Christopher Whitlock." Elena had read it 3 times, looking for the manipulation, the hidden agenda, the way he might be trying to use her guilt against her. But it had seemed genuine. Tired, defeated, but genuine. "What do you think?" she'd asked Adrian, handing him the letter. He'd read it carefully. "I think your father finally realized what he lost. What do you want to do?" "I want—" Elena had stopped, really thinking about it. "I want to let him come. Not because I forgive him completely, but because I want to be the kind of person who can accept an apology, even an imperfect one. Then invite him. Just like that? Just like that. You get to decide who matters in your life now, Elena. You don't have to carry old grudges just because they're familiar. She'd written back that evening, a brief acceptance that offered presence but not absolution. Her father could attend, could witness what she'd built without him, could see the life she'd chosen over the one he'd tried to force on her. Whether that would be enough for either of them remained to be seen. The week before the wedding, the completed Pemberton estate audit had arrived, a thick portfolio of recommendations that would revolutionize his operations and establish Elena as someone who actually knew what she was doing. She'd presented it in person, walking Pemberton through every suggestion, every cost projection, every expected outcome. When she'd finished, he'd sat back in his chair and laughed. My God, you're going to put half the estate managers in England out of work. Only the incompetent ones. That's most of them. He'd signed the implementation contract on the spot. When can you start? January, after I've settled into Greystone properly and organized Adrian's household systems. Fair enough? I'll wait. He'd stood, offered his hand for a professional shake. Thank you, Miss Whitlock. Or should I say, Your Grace? Not yet. And when I am, I'll still prefer Elena when we're discussing business. Elena it is. She'd left Pemberton's estate feeling something she hadn't felt since leaving Thornfield, the satisfaction of work well done and properly recognized. On the drive back to Greystone, she'd let herself imagine a future where this was normal, where women could consult professionally, could be valued for expertise rather than decorative presence, could build careers on competence instead of marriage. It had seemed impossible, but 6 months ago, leaving Thornfield had seemed impossible too. And look at her now. The night before the wedding, Elena had stood in the completed East Wing and looked at everything she'd built. Not just the physical restoration, though that was impressive, but the systems, the new household protocols, the tenant assistance program now running smoothly, the supplier relationships she'd renegotiated, the financial structures that had turned Greystone from a failing estate into a sustainable enterprise. She'd built something real, something that would last beyond her, that would matter to people she'd never meet. Second thoughts? Adrian had appeared behind her, as he often did these days. No, just thinking. About? About the fact that 6 months ago I was invisible, and now I'm... She'd gestured to the space around them. This. Impossible to ignore? Terrifying to acknowledge. She'd turned to face him. Adrian, what if I'm not good at being a duchess? What if I embarrass you at social functions, say the wrong thing to important people, fail to perform the role properly? Then you'll embarrass me, say wrong things, and fail to perform. And I'll love you anyway. He'd pulled her close. Elena, I'm not marrying you for your ability to navigate society. I'm marrying you because you make me want to be honest instead of diplomatic, real instead of polished, because you see problems and solve them instead of just managing the appearance of solutions. That's not very duchess-like. Good. The world has enough decorative duchesses. It needs more competent ones. She'd kissed him, thinking that maybe tomorrow wouldn't be about becoming someone new. Maybe it would be about finally, fully, being allowed to be herself. And for a woman who'd spent her whole life invisible, that felt like the most radical act of all. The morning of the wedding, Elena woke before dawn to find rain hammering against the windows of her room. Perfect, she'd thought, watching water stream down the glass. Nothing about this has been conventional. Why start now? She'd dressed herself. No elaborate ritual with maids fussing over every detail. Just her pulling on the ivory silk gown she and Mrs. Hartwell had chosen together. Simple lines, minimal decoration, nothing that would make her feel like she was performing someone else's idea of a bride. The only concession to tradition was her mother's pearl necklace, cool against her skin. A knock at the door had interrupted her attempts to pin her own hair. Come in. Lydia had entered carrying a small leather case. She'd looked different than Elena remembered. Thinner, still, but somehow more solid, less performed. I thought you might need help, Lydia had said, gesturing to Elena's half-finished attempt at an updo. I was managing. You were creating a disaster. Lydia had crossed to the vanity. Sit. Let me. Elena had sat, watching her sister's reflection in the mirror as capable hands had worked through her dark hair. They'd been silent for a long moment, the only sound the rain and the whisper of brush through hair. I've been running Thornfield, Lydia had said finally. Actually running it, the way you used to. How's that going? Terribly. I made 3 major mistakes in the first month alone. Nearly bankrupted the East tenants by miscalculating the grain subsidy. She'd paused, pinning a section of hair. But I fixed it. Used your notes, asked for help from the steward you recommended, and actually fixed it myself. I'm glad. Are you? I wouldn't blame you if you wanted me to fail. Elena had met Lydia's eyes in the mirror. I wanted you to try. Failure's just part of that. Father says I'm too hard on the staff, that I've forgotten how to be charming. Lydia's heads had kept working, steady, despite the emotion in her voice. I told him charm doesn't balance account books. What did he say to that? That I was starting to sound like you. A pause. He meant it as a criticism. I took it as a compliment. Elena had felt something warm expand in her chest. Good. When Lydia had finished, Elena's hair had been arranged in something elegant but unfussy, the kind of style that looked like she'd made an effort without trying to be someone she wasn't. Thank you, Elena had said. Thank you for the notes, the ones you've been sending about Thornfield. Lydia had set down the brush. You didn't have to help me, after everything I did. No, but I wanted to. Elena had turned to face her sister directly. Lydia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you actually changing, or are you just performing change because it's what I want to see? Lydia had been quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet. I think I'm trying to change. But I catch myself performing all the time, saying what I think people want to hear instead of what's true. It's a hard habit to break. Yes, it is. But I want to break it. That has to count for something. It counts for everything. Elena had stood, picked up the leather case Lydia had brought. What's this? Your wedding gift, from me and Father. He wanted to give it to you himself, but I told him you'd probably throw it at him if he tried. Inside the case had been a deed, the transfer of ownership for Thornfield's Eastern Woodlands, the section Elena had always loved, to Elena Whitlock Vale. It's not much, Lydia had said quickly. Just a few 100 acres. But Father said it was the only part of the estate that showed profit consistently, and that was because of the management protocols you'd established, so it should be yours. Elena had stared at the document, this tangible acknowledgement of her work, her competence, her value. This is worth thousands of pounds. I know. Father's creditors weren't pleased, but he insisted. Lydia had touched Elena's arm. He's trying, in his own inadequate, too-late way. He's trying. Tell him thank you, and tell him, Elena had paused, choosing her words carefully. Tell him I'll visit, after the honeymoon, not to stay, but to visit. He'll like that. I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it because I'm tired of cutting people out of my life just because they've hurt me. That's its own kind of prison. Lydia had hugged her then, and it had felt less desperate than before, more real. The ceremony had taken place in the restored East Wing at 10 in the morning, with rain still pouring outside but light streaming through the new windows. There had been perhaps 50 people in attendance, local families, estate workers, a few of Adrian's friends from London who'd remained loyal despite the scandal. Lord Whitlock had sat in the third row, looking older and smaller than Elena remembered. Mrs. Hartwell had cried through the entire thing, and Lydia had stood beside Elena as her only attendant, wearing a dress that was beautiful but not attention-seeking. The vicar had kept it brief. Elena had appreciated that. She'd never been one for lengthy ceremonies or flowery language. When it had come time for the vows, Adrian had taken her hands and spoken clearly enough for everyone to hear. I promise to see you, not the version of you that's useful or convenient or easy to manage. The real you, difficult and brilliant and absolutely unwilling to compromise on things that matter. I promise to build something honest with you, even when honesty is uncomfortable. And I promise to never ever ask you to be invisible again. Elena's throat had tightened. She'd squeezed his hands and spoken her own vows, the ones she'd written at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. I promise to be honest with you, even when it would be easier to stay quiet. I promise to build instead of just manage, to choose instead of just accept. And I promise to keep fighting to be seen, because you've shown me that being seen is worth the risk. They'd been married then, officially and irrevocably, and when Adrian had kissed her, it had tasted like rain and truth, and the future they were choosing together. The breakfast afterward had been held in the main dining room, the one Elena had declared absurd, but which actually made sense for 50 people. She'd stood at the head of the table beside Adrian, looking at the gathered faces, and felt something she'd never experienced at Thornfield. She'd felt wanted, not needed, not useful, not tolerated. Wanted. Lord Pemberton had stood to make a toast, his weathered face creased with what might have been respect. "I'm not much for speeches," he'd begun, "but I wanted to say something about the new Duchess. 3 months ago, she took a failing estate and turned it into a model of modern management. She did the same for my estate in half the time. And she did it all while half of London society was whispering that she was either mad or manipulative or both." He'd raised his glass. "To the Duchess of Vale, who proved that competence matters more than reputation and honesty matters more than performance. May you continue to terrify incompetent estate managers everywhere." Laughter had rippled through the room. Elena had felt her face flush, but she'd raised her glass in acknowledgement. Then her father had stood, and the room had gone quiet. "I don't deserve to speak," Lord Whitlock had said, his voice rough. "I failed my daughter in every way that mattered. But I'm going to speak anyway, because she needs to hear this, and I need to say it." He'd looked directly at Elena. "You were the best thing about Thornfield, and I was too blind to see it until you were gone. You kept that estate alive with your competence while I squandered its resources on vanity and gambling. You deserved better than I gave you, better than I was capable of giving." He'd raised his glass with a shaking hand. "To my daughter, who succeeded in spite of me, not because of me. May your future be everything I denied you in the past." It hadn't been a perfect apology. It had been inadequate and late and tinged with self-pity. But it had been honest, and Elena had found herself nodding acknowledgement across the room. Progress, she'd thought. Imperfect, uncomfortable progress. The afternoon had passed in a blur of conversation and well-wishes. Elena had found herself talking to people she'd never met. Landowners who'd heard about her work, women curious about how she'd managed to build a career in estate management, even a few young women who'd asked if she'd consider taking apprentices. "Apprentices?" Elena had repeated, startled. "Someone to train," the young woman, Sarah, daughter of a local merchant, had clarified. "I want to learn estate management. Actual management, not just household decorating. But no one will teach a woman, except apparently you." Elena had looked at Adrian, who'd been listening with barely concealed amusement. "What do you think? Should we train the next generation of terrifying female estate managers? I think it's inevitable at this point. You've already started a revolution. Might as well make it systematic." So Elena had agreed to consider it, and by the end of the afternoon, 3 young women had asked about apprenticeships, and she'd found herself accidentally starting something that looked suspiciously like a training program. As the sun had finally broken through the clouds late in the day, Adrian had pulled Elena aside into the small library off the main hall. "How are you holding up?" he'd asked. "I just accidentally committed to training apprentices and reforming estate management education. I'm not entirely sure what happened." "You became exactly who you were always meant to be. That's what happened." He'd kissed her temple. "Are you happy?" "Yes." Terrified but happy. She'd leaned into him. "Is it always going to be like this? People watching, judging, expecting things?" "Probably. But you know what I've learned watching you these past months?" "What?" "That you're at your best when people are watching. Not performing for them. Just being so undeniably competent that they can't look away." He'd pulled back to meet her eyes. "You were made to be seen, Elena. You just needed to believe you were worth seeing." She'd kissed him then, in the small library where no one could witness it, tasting like champagne and contentment and the radical act of choosing herself. The real confrontation had come 3 weeks later, at the first major social event Elena attended as the Duchess of Vale. Lord and Lady Marchmont had hosted a dinner for local landowners and their families, the kind of event where reputations were made or destroyed over multiple courses and careful conversation. Elena had known she couldn't avoid it forever, but she'd been dreading it with every fiber of her being. "We don't have to go," Adrian had said as they dressed for dinner. "Yes, we do. If I don't face them now, they'll always see me as the woman who hid from society because she couldn't handle the judgment. You're not hiding, you're choosing where to spend your energy. That's what hiding looks like when you're trying to maintain dignity." She'd straightened his cravat, then stepped back to survey him. Besides, I need to see if I can actually do this. Be a duchess at a proper social function without either boring everyone to death with agricultural policy or saying something that gets us blacklisted from decent society. Those are very specific fears. They're very likely outcomes. But she'd gone, wearing a deep blue gown that Mrs. Hartwell had assured her was both appropriate and striking, her mother's pearls at her throat like armor. The Marchmont estate had been everything Greystone wasn't. Perfectly maintained, traditionally elegant, the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened because interesting meant scandalous. Elena had felt every eye in the room turn toward her when they'd been announced. The Duke and Duchess of Vale, the butler had intoned, and the whispers had started immediately. Lady Marchmont had greeted them with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your Grace, how lovely to finally meet you properly. We've heard so much about your work at Greystone." The pause before work had been deliberate. "All true, I'm sure," Elena had replied pleasantly. "The East Wing restoration exceeded our expectations." "Yes, we heard you were quite involved in the construction. How unusual." "Unusual, perhaps, but effective." Elena had kept her voice level. "Sometimes the traditional approaches don't actually work, and you need someone willing to try something different." She'd been seated at dinner between Lord Marchmont and a baronet whose name she immediately forgot, both of whom had seemed uncertain whether to engage her in conversation or just avoid eye contact. Lord Marchmont had chosen engagement. "Your husband speaks very highly of your management skills, Your Grace." "That's kind of him." "He says you've increased Greystone's profitability by nearly 30% in 6 months. That's remarkable, if true." "It's true, though much of it was simply stopping the hemorrhaging from embezzlement and inefficiency. The previous housekeeper had been stealing for years." "And you discovered this?" I looked at the account books. The discrepancies were obvious to anyone who bothered to actually review them. Lord Marchmont had set down his fork. "Your Grace, may I ask you a direct question?" "Please." "Why? You're a duchess now. You could spend your days doing, well, whatever it is duchesses typically do. Why involve yourself in estate management at all?" Elena had taken a sip of wine, considering her answer. She could say something diplomatic, something that wouldn't offend. Or she could tell the truth. She'd chosen truth, because estate management affects real people. Tenants who need fair rents and safe housing, workers who need living wages and decent conditions, families whose lives depend on the decisions landowners make. And because most landowners, no offense, treat it as an afterthought. Something to delegate while they focus on politics or society or hunting. She'd met his eyes. "I involve myself because I'm good at it, because it matters, and because I refuse to waste my life on things that don't." The table had gone quiet. Elena had braced herself for offense, for dismissal, for the social consequences of speaking too directly. Instead, Lord Marchmont had started laughing. "My wife told me you'd be refreshingly blunt," he'd said. She understated it considerably. He'd raised his glass toward Elena. "You're absolutely right. Most of us are terrible at it. I've been trying to modernize my operations for 3 years and getting nowhere. Would you be willing to consult?" Elena had blinked. "You want to hire me?" "If you're taking clients, Pemberton says you're the best estate manager he's seen in 40 years, and he's not a man given to exaggeration." Yes, I'm taking clients." "Excellent. We'll discuss terms after dinner." And just like that, the entire atmosphere at the table had shifted. Women who'd been whispering about her had started asking questions about the apprenticeship program. Men who'd been dismissive had started inquiring about her methods. Even Lady Marchmont had thawed slightly, asking about the East Wing restoration with what seemed like genuine interest. By the time dessert was served, Elena had 3 new consulting contracts, had been invited to speak at an Agricultural Reform Society meeting, and had accidentally become the evening's most sought-after conversationalist. "I think you just won," Adrian had murmured to her as they'd moved to the drawing room for after-dinner drinks. "Won what?" "Society. You stopped trying to fit in and just existed, and they had to adjust to you instead of the other way around." "That feels too easy." "It wasn't easy. You've been building toward this for months. You just finally had the audience that mattered." Later, as they'd prepared to leave, Lady Marchmont had pulled Elena aside. "I owe you an apology, Your Grace," she'd said quietly. I believed the rumors about you, the letters from your sister painting you as manipulative and unstable. I judged you without knowing you. Most people did. Yes, but most people haven't seen you work. I spoke with Lord Pemberton after dinner. He showed me the audit you prepared for him, the level of detail, the depth of analysis. That's not the work of someone unstable. That's the work of someone extraordinary. She'd paused. I have a daughter, 15. Bright, but society keeps telling her that brightness in women is unattractive. I'd like her to meet you, to see that there's another option besides performing vapid charm until some man decides to marry her. Elena had felt something shift in her chest. I'd be happy to meet her. Thank you. And your grace? I'm glad you didn't let them make you invisible. The world needs women like you visible. On the carriage ride home, Elena had sat beside Adrian in silence, processing what had just happened. I think I just became respectable, she'd said finally. Is that good or bad? I'm not sure yet. It feels strange. Like I spent so long fighting to be seen that I forgot what I'd do once people actually looked. What do you want to do? Change things. Actually change them. Not just for me, but for all the women who've been told their competence doesn't matter as much as their appearance. For the Sarahs who want to learn estate management but have no one to teach them. For the Lydias who've been trapped in performances they never chose. She'd looked at him. Is that too ambitious? Probably. But so was restoring the East Wing in 10 weeks. And you did that. He'd taken her hand. Elena, you're not going to change the entire social structure overnight. But you can train those apprentices. You can consult for estates and show that women's management is as valuable as men's. You can exist loudly and competently and force people to acknowledge that their assumptions were wrong. That sounds exhausting. It will be, but you've never chosen easy over important. Elena had laughed and it had felt like release. No, I really haven't. The transformation had continued through the fall. Elena had taken on 4 apprentices, young women from various backgrounds who wanted to learn actual estate management. She'd established a formal training program, teaching them everything from account analysis to tenant relations to construction project management. She'd consulted for 6 estates, increasing profitability and improving conditions for workers across 3 counties. And she'd done it all while being unquestionably, visibly herself. No performance, no shrinking. Just Elena Whitlock Vale, Duchess of Vale, terrifying estate managers and revolutionizing how women's work was valued. The apprentices had been her favorite part. Watching young women learn to analyze budgets, negotiate contracts, stand up to condescending stewards who thought they knew better, it had felt like planting seeds for a future she'd never imagined. You're building an army, Adrian had observed one afternoon, watching Elena lead a particularly intense discussion about drainage systems with her 4 students. I'm building competence. If it happens to look like an army, that's just a bonus. The local estate managers are terrified of you. Pemberton told me 3 of them tried to get their employers to ban you from consulting in the area. How'd that work out for them? Their employers hired you instead. Turns out people value results over ego protection. Elena had grinned. Shocking. But not everything had been smooth. There had been pushback, articles in London papers questioning whether it was appropriate for a duchess to engage in trade, whispers that she was unmanning her husband by being more competent than him, social events where she'd been pointedly excluded because her presence made other women uncomfortable. Elena had weathered it all with the same approach. Keep working, keep succeeding, keep existing loudly enough that people couldn't pretend she didn't matter. And slowly, grudgingly, society had begun to shift. The final confrontation with her old life had come in December, when Elena had returned to Thornfield for the first time since leaving. She'd driven up alone in the carriage. Adrian had offered to come, but she'd needed to do this by herself. The estate had looked different in winter light, smaller somehow, less imposing. Lydia had met her at the door, looking capable in a simple dress that prioritized function over fashion. "Welcome home," Lydia had said, then caught herself. "Sorry, welcome back. This isn't your home anymore." No, but it was. Elena had stepped inside, and the familiar smell of the house had hit her. Beeswax and old wood, and the particular mustiness of a building that was always slightly damp. "How are things?" "Better. Still not good, but better." Lydia had led her to the estate office, Elena's old domain. "I wanted you to see this." The office had been transformed. Where Elena had kept meticulous but sparse records, Lydia had created systems. Color-coded filing, detailed charts tracking every aspect of the estate's operations, notes posted everywhere in Lydia's careful handwriting. I copied your methods, Lydia had admitted. But I made them my own, more visual, more systematic. It works better for how my brain processes information. Elena had walked slowly around the room, taking it in. This wasn't just copying. This was understanding the principles and adapting them. This was actual competence. This is impressive, Lydia. Is it? Her sister had sounded genuinely uncertain. I keep thinking I'm missing something, that you'd see 100 flaws I'm too inexperienced to notice. There are probably inefficiencies, but you'll find them as you go. That's how learning works. Elena had turned to face her sister. I'm proud of you. Lydia's eyes had filled. Don't. If you're nice to me, I'll cry, and I've worked very hard on not being the sister who cries all the time. Too late. Elena had crossed to her, pulled her into a hug. You did this, Lydia, not me. You chose to change and you actually did the work. That's harder than anything I've ever done. That's not true. It is. I was always competent. You had to become it against everything you were taught to value. That takes real courage. They'd stood there in the office, two sisters who'd spent their lives in opposition, finally finding something like understanding. Father wants to see you, Lydia had said when they'd separated. He's in the library. Lord Whitlock had aged in the 6 months since Elena had seen him. More gray in his hair, deeper lines in his face, a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. Elena? He'd stood when she'd entered, then seemed uncertain whether to approach. Thank you for coming. You're welcome. She'd stayed near the door, maintaining distance. Lydia says the estate is improving. Because of her work. And yours. The systems you left. The recommendations you've been sending. He gestured to a chair. Please sit. I won't keep you long. Elena had sat, watching her father carefully. He'd looked diminished, this man who'd once seemed so imposing. I wanted to tell you something, he'd begun. Something I should have said months ago, years ago. I was wrong about you. About what mattered. I valued appearance over substance, charm over competence, easy pleasures over difficult truths. And in doing so, I nearly destroyed this estate and definitely destroyed my relationship with the daughter who actually loved it. Father, let me finish. Please. He'd taken a shaking breath. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I gave you nothing. No support, no recognition, no love that wasn't conditional on your usefulness. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see what I lost when you left. And I see what you've built since leaving. You're extraordinary, Elena. You always were. I was just too blind and stupid to recognize it. Elena had sat with his words, feeling them settle. They didn't erase the years of being invisible, of being taken for granted, of watching Lydia receive the affection she'd craved. But they acknowledged it, and that was something. I can't forget what it was like here, she'd said finally. Always being useful but never valued. Watching you choose Lydia over me every time something mattered. That shaped me, Father. Made me believe I was only worth what I could provide. I know. And I'm sorry. But I also can't stay angry forever. It's exhausting, and it keeps me chained to the past. She'd met his eyes. So here's what I can offer. Visits. Occasional advice on estate management. Maybe eventually something that looks like a relationship, if we both work at it. But I won't go back to being invisible. Not for you, not for anyone. I wouldn't ask you to. He'd smiled slightly. I couldn't if I tried. You're the Duchess of Vale now. You consult for half the county. You're training the next generation of estate managers. You're too visible to hide anymore. Yes, I am. I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to that pride, but I am, anyway. Elena had stood, crossed to him, and done something she hadn't done since childhood. She'd hugged her father. Briefly, awkwardly, but genuinely. Thank you for the woodlands, she'd said. They're being well managed. I never doubted it. She'd left Thornfield that afternoon with something lighter in her chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but release. The past would always be the past, but it didn't have to define her future. The winter social season had brought unexpected validation. Elena had been invited to present at the Royal Agricultural Society's annual meeting, the first woman ever asked to speak. She'd stood before 200 landowners and experts and presented her theories on sustainable estate management, backing every claim with data from her consulting work. The room had been silent when she'd finished. Then Lord Pemberton had stood and applauded, and one by one, the rest had joined him. Afterward, the Society's president had approached her. "Your Grace, we'd like to offer you a formal position, Consulting Director for Estate Modernization. You'd work with landowners across the country to implement sustainable practices." "I'm a woman," Elena had said bluntly. "Your membership has never included women." "Then it's time we changed that. Your work speaks for itself. We'd be fools to let gender prevent us from utilizing genuine expertise." Elena had accepted on the spot. The news had spread through London society like fire through dry timber. The Duchess of Vale, the woman who'd been painted as unstable and manipulative just months ago, had been appointed to one of the most prestigious agricultural positions in the country. Lydia's retraction letters had been vindicated. Lord Whitlock's change of heart had been justified. And Elena's decision to exist loudly instead of apologizing for her competence had been proven right. She'd received letters from women across the country, some congratulating her, some asking for advice, some simply expressing gratitude that someone had proven it was possible. One letter in particular had caught her attention, from a young woman in Yorkshire. "You showed me that being invisible was a choice, not a requirement. Thank you for choosing to be seen." Elena had kept that letter in her desk drawer, a reminder of why the work mattered. Spring had arrived at Greystone with cherry blossoms and new beginnings. Elena's apprentices had completed their first year of training, and all 4 had secured positions managing estates for landowners who'd attended their final presentations. Sarah had been hired by Lord Marchmont himself, becoming the first female estate manager in the county. The consulting practice had grown beyond what Elena could manage alone, so she'd hired 2 assistants, both women, both trained in her methods. Together, they'd revolutionized operations at 12 estates, increasing profitability while improving conditions for workers. And Elena had done it all while being unapologetically herself, direct, competent, unwilling to soften her expertise to make men comfortable. One evening in late April, she'd stood in the music room at Greystone playing Chopin while Adrian worked on correspondence in the adjacent library. She'd played with her eyes closed, losing herself in the music the way she used to in private, no longer caring if anyone heard or saw. When she'd finished, she'd found Adrian standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she'd learned to recognize, love mixed with admiration, mixed with slight bewilderment that this was actually his life. "What?" she'd asked. "Just thinking about the first time I saw you play. You were so careful to hide how deeply you felt things, and now you just—" He'd gestured to the piano. "You just let it show. I got tired of hiding. I've noticed. The entire country's noticed. Is that a problem?" "It's magnificent." He'd crossed to her, pulled her to her feet, held her close. "You've changed everything, you know. Not just for yourself, but for every woman watching you prove it's possible. I didn't do it for them. I know. You did it because you couldn't keep being invisible. But the effect is the same. You showed them another way to exist." Elena had rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, thinking about the woman she'd been a year ago. Invisible, useful, disappearing into the margins of her own life. That woman was gone, and Elena didn't miss her. "Do you ever regret it?" she'd asked. "Marrying the woman who causes scandals and makes people uncomfortable and refuses to perform traditional Duchess behavior?" "Every day," Adrian had said, and she'd pulled back to look at his face. He'd been grinning. "I regret that I didn't find you sooner, that I wasted time writing ambiguous letters instead of just asking you directly to marry me, that I almost let Lydia's performance convince me I wanted easy charm instead of difficult honesty." "That's not what I asked. I know, but it's my answer anyway." He'd kissed her forehead. "Elena, marrying you is the best decision I've ever made, even when you're terrifying my peers and revolutionizing centuries of tradition and generally making everyone question their assumptions about how society should work." "Especially then?" "Especially then." They'd stood there in the music room, surrounded by the evidence of their unconventional life, and Elena had felt something she'd never experienced before: complete, unquestioning certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The final transformation had come in June, at the first meeting of the Estate Management Training Institute. the formal organization Elena had founded to train women in professional estate management. 23 women had attended, ranging from 16 to 45 from across England and Scotland. They'd gathered in Greystone's restored East Wing, in the space Elena had rebuilt from ruins, and listened as she'd outlined the program. "This won't be easy," she'd told them. "You'll be challenged, questioned, dismissed by people who think women can't do this work. You'll make mistakes. You'll face situations where being female is used against you, and you'll have to work twice as hard to earn half the recognition." She'd paused, looking at their faces, young and old, hopeful and determined. "But you can do it. I know you can, because you're here. Because you chose to pursue competence over comfort, substance over performance, reality over illusion. And that choice, that decision to be seen as you actually are instead of hiding to make others comfortable, that's the hardest part. The rest is just work." One of the older women had raised her hand. "Your Grace, may I ask, was it worth it? All the scandal, the social consequences, the people who still refuse to accept a woman in this role?" Elena had thought about the question, about leaving Thornfield, about facing down Lydia's poison campaign, about standing in front of the Agricultural Society and proving her worth, about every moment she'd chosen visibility over safety. "Yes," she'd said simply, "because the alternative was spending my life invisible. And I've learned that being seen, really seen, for exactly who you are, is worth any cost." The women had nodded, understanding in their eyes. As Elena had worked with them over the following weeks, teaching and training and watching them develop into competent professionals, she'd realized something profound. She wasn't just teaching estate management. She was teaching women that they didn't have to choose between being valued and being themselves, that competence and authenticity could coexist, that being difficult and brilliant and unwilling to compromise wasn't a flaw. It was strength. And slowly, student by student, estate by estate, the world was beginning to agree. 6 months later, Elena had sat in the estate office at Greystone, not the small room she'd first claimed, but the large formal office that had once been reserved for the Duke alone. Adrian had insisted she take it, moving his own work to the library, saying she needed the space more than he did. The desk was covered with correspondence, consulting requests, apprentice applications, letters from women thanking her for showing them another path. On the wall hung a framed copy of her appointment to the Royal Agricultural Society. In the corner sat her mother's music portfolio, a reminder of the woman who'd taught her that feeling deeply wasn't weakness. A knock at the door had interrupted her review of a particularly complex estate analysis. "Come in." Adrian had entered carrying a letter. "This just arrived, from the Prime Minister's office." Elena had looked up sharply. "What?" "He's forming a committee to modernize agricultural policy. He wants you on it." Adrian had set the letter on her desk. "As a voting member, not as someone's wife or a token female presence, as an expert in your own right." Elena had read the letter twice, making sure she understood correctly. This was official recognition at the highest level. This was her work being valued by the government itself. That's unprecedented, scandalous, absolutely deserved. Adrian had grinned. "What do you think? Should the Duchess of Vale help shape national agricultural policy?" Elena had thought about the girl she'd been. Invisible in her father's house, erased by her sister's performance, told implicitly and explicitly that her value lay only in her usefulness to others. Then she'd thought about the woman she'd become, visible, valued, choosing her own path instead of accepting the one prescribed for her. "Yes," she'd said, "I should." That evening, Elena had played piano in the music room while Adrian sat in his usual chair, reading. She'd played her mother's favorite compositions, her own eyes closed, feeling every note in her chest. She'd played for herself, not performing, not proving anything, just existing in the fullness of who she was. And when she'd finished, she'd opened her eyes to find not just Adrian watching, but 3 of her apprentices who'd been working late in the library, Mrs. Hartwell carrying tea, even Thomas, the groundskeeper, standing just outside the doorway. All of them seeing her. Really seeing her. Elena had stood from the piano bench and looked at the life she'd built, the work that mattered, the people who valued her, the future she'd chosen instead of accepted. It wasn't perfect. She still made mistakes, still faced resistance, still struggled with the weight of visibility after so many years of hiding. but it was real, honest, hers. And in a world that had tried to make her invisible, Elena Whitlock Vale had become impossible to ignore. She'd become the woman who commanded the room, not through performance or charm or by making herself smaller to fit someone else's expectations, but by being exactly, unapologetically, magnificently herself. And that she'd realized was the only kind of power that actually mattered.